Hey friends, welcome to Mystery Con. What if the weather wasn't natural? What if your emotions were being tracked? And what if the air itself was being used to control you? The truth is out there, and it's in the air. Before we start, please make sure to hit that like and subscribe and let me know from where you are watching. Thanks. They said the skies were free, but the first time I noticed the pattern in the clouds, I knew they'd lied. I was mid-race, banking hard around the G6 Tower's aerial loop, my drone slicing through a crimson dusk as 30,000 viewers streamed my POV. The city, New Avalon, looked like a rendered dream from above. Neon veins wrapped the skyline, and the noise down below felt like someone else's problem. Up here, I was Kai Len, pilot, brand ambassador, and digital demigod. But the glitch, the glitch, changed everything. My overlay flickered. Only for a second. But that second showed me something the algorithm never intended. A cluster of chemtrails cutting across the western sky in a formation too exact to be random. 6 lines, evenly spaced, forming a rotating helix that pulsed in sync with my drone's telemetry. No wind could do that. No pilot would fly that tight without cause. It was like watching code write itself in vapor. I clipped the frame, tagged it for later, and kept racing. My sponsors wouldn't tolerate dead air. Back at my studio loft, I isolated the footage, slow it, enhanced it. I was expecting artifacting, maybe a stray reflection. Instead, I saw data, actual characters, flashing for brief frames inside the trail's spiral. ASCII embedded in aerosol. I didn't sleep that night, just looped the segment again and again, cross-checking against satellite wind patterns and flight logs. Nothing added up. I dumped the stream on my side channel, a little Easter egg for the forum nerds who still believed in spectral analysis and post-scarcity conspiracies. Within hours, the clip went viral, then gone, not flagged, vanished, like it never existed. My mirrors? Empty. Backup drives? Corrupted. The original file? Locked out of my own rig. That's when I noticed the view count on my main channel, flatlining. Comments stopped. Even my face, my own damn face, was being scrubbed from search. I messaged Juno, my modern ex. She said nothing was wrong, but her account had been inactive for 3 days. Something was off, not just digital, not just social, deep off, like I'd triggered a system not meant to be seen. And someone, was already working to reset the frame. The silence hit me harder than the takedown. No alerts, no replies, no noise, just quiet. Too quiet, normally. When a stream clips the edge of weird, my feed lights up with fan theories, edits, even the occasional AI-generated remix. But after the chemtrail footage, it was as if I'd slipped off the map. My inbox was empty. Brand dashboards showed flat lines. No engagement, no comments, no trolls, like I'd stopped existing in the eyes of the machine. I tried logging into my drone control interface. The app just looped a blank login screen. I checked my other devices. Same. Account locked. Session expired, it said. I reset the password. Locked again within seconds. I knew then this wasn't a glitch. It was a hand. Someone was pulling strings, silencing me with surgical precision. I reached out to Dax, a streamer I met during a collaboration in Neo Tokyo. We weren't close, but he knew the underground routing protocols the fallback tools we used when the main platforms got too aggressive with enforcement. No response. I checked his page, deleted, entire archive scrubbed, as if he'd never existed. My heart thudded as I scrolled through our old collab clips, nothing but error pages. That's when I noticed something else. My smart mirrors stopped syncing. Weather feeds were static. Even the fridge display showed yesterday's forecast, frozen in time. My loft, once a hyper-connected sandbox of personal AI, had become a dead zone. I stepped out onto the balcony to catch a drone signal and saw it, the same spiral pattern just forming, faint but there. Vapor trails against the dusk, pulsing slow and even. I raised my lens, but the app wouldn't open, so I just watched, felt it, like the pattern was scanning me, not the other way around. I had no proof, no footage, nothing I could post, but I knew it was all connected. The chemtrails, the silence, the data wipe. It wasn't a coincidence, it was design. That night, I rerouted my rig through an old analog patchboard, bypassing the mesh net. I booted up an offline decoder I hadn't touched in years, one that didn't ping servers when it ran. I fed it the only thing I had left, a single frame I had screen capped on instinct before the footage vanished. As it processed, a message, rendered in green across black. Project Zephyr initiated, public interface, active influencer profiles. I stared at the screen, the words repeating like a heartbeat. It wasn't just watching us, it was using us. I didn't sleep that night. The message kept replaying in my head like a corrupted loop. Public interface, active influencer profiles. It wasn't a warning, it was a status report, which meant this thing, Project Zephyr, had been running for a while. And I'd been part of it without knowing. I started thinking back. Sponsorships that came out of nowhere, analytics that never quite made sense, spikes in engagement after emotionally charged content. Maybe it wasn't just luck or algorithm timing. Maybe those patterns were the point. My videos weren't just entertainment. They were data inputs, triggers, test cases. I scoured my archives, but most of my raw footage was gone. Even my encrypted backups were corrupted. I found fragments, half-rendered clips, broken audio, out-of-sync telemetry files. In one, I'm mid-race, and the crowd noise cuts out completely. The camera pans just slightly off course, catching a drone that isn't mine. It's sleek, unbranded, and following me. No metadata. No heat signature. I'd never noticed it during the live run. I checked other races, same drone, same distance, always watching, never interfering, until now. I needed someone who could help, someone off-grid. I remembered Aaron, an ex-platform engineer turned dropout who specialized in predictive systems. Last I heard, he was squatting in the metro tunnels under Sector 9. I pulled my gear and ditched the tower, riding a city bike to avoid surveillance grids. As I moved through the street-level fog, I saw myself, or what used to be me, plastered across storefront ads. My old sponsor clips ran in loops, even though my account was locked. But the sound was different. My voice wasn't mine. It was close, but hollow, reconstructed. I kept my head down until I reached the tunnel entrance. No cams, no drones, just old steel and rusted signage. Inside, the noise of the city faded into damp silence. I found Erin by the blue glow of 6 screens, surrounded by batteries and wires. He didn't look surprised. "You've been triggering a lot of noise," he said. "Zephyr's predictive models flagged you 2 months ago. They're not just testing weather patterns, they're testing people. And you broke their curve." I didn't respond. I just handed him the frame. He looked at it once, then sighed. Then it's already started. Erin's space felt like the last place on Earth untouched by the network. Everything was manual, wired interfaces, analog meters, even a paper logbook he scribbled in when the systems blinked out. He slid my frame into an isolated decoder, a machine built from scavenged parts, humming low like a trapped insect. As it passed the image, he explained, Project Zephyr wasn't just environmental, it was behavioral. Influencers like me weren't targets, we were tools. Our uploads, reactions, emotional spikes, they were all feedback, shaping how far the system could push environmental shifts without triggering mass resistance. He showed me logs he'd pulled from defunct satellite relays. There were patterns, air quality spikes tied to influencer scandals, weather changes synced with trending videos, emotional data mapped across entire regions. "They call it tuning," Erin said. "They push a change, watch the emotional pulse across platforms, then calibrate again." I stared at the graphs, each line a different influencer, rising and falling with public mood. My name sat at the top of one chart, highlighted in red. Deviation, threshold, exceeded. That's why my content vanished. Not because I exposed something, but because I stopped reacting the way they expected. I wasn't feeding the loop anymore. I'd broken rhythm. Erin leaned back in his chair, rubbing tired eyes. "You're not the only one. There's a few of you. Different fields, different formats, but all flagged." He handed me a worn notebook. Inside were names, encrypted handles, dead links. People who had noticed, pushed back, then disappeared. I asked him what Zephyr's endgame was. He didn't answer directly, just turned one screen toward me. A live satellite feed filtered for motion in the upper atmosphere. Dozens of spirals identical to the one I saw, each pulsing in a calculated loop. "They're not adjusting to us anymore," he said. "They're shaping us to adjust to them." I didn't speak. The weight of it settled in my chest like concrete. My entire career, my identity was part of a simulation loop, crafted and measured for influence. Now that I was out of sync, the system had labeled me an anomaly, and anomalies get erased. I stayed underground for 3 days. No signal, no broadcast. Erin rerouted my biometrics through an anonymized shell, just enough to keep city sensors from tagging me as missing. I didn't speak much. Most of my time was spent staring at the spirals on his screens, trying to understand how something so beautiful could be so controlled. Erin called them the Ghost Circuit, a network of atmospheric data loops shaped by Zephyr to test more than just mood. He believed it was conditioning, microclimate tweaks, subtle delays in dopamine feedback, even light modulation, all carefully tuned to nudge behavior without notice. The notebook he gave me kept growing heavier, not from weight, but meaning. Each name inside represented someone who'd seen through the facade and paid the price. A podcaster from the Europlex who vanished mid-live stream. A VR architect who leaked a corrupted environment patch tied to mood regulation. a teacher from the free net who posted barometric readings that matched sentiment swings. All gone, accounts wiped, homes cleared, social trails erased clean, like they'd never mattered, like they'd never existed. On the fourth night, Erin patched into a dormant relay tucked beneath the old transit grid. It hadn't been used in years, but it still had power. He handed me a headset and told me to listen. At first it was static, then a voice, faint and fragmented, came through. "This is not a broadcast. This is a retention loop. If you're hearing this, you've already been profiled. Stay offline. Trust nothing labeled curated." The voice repeated 3 times, before cutting out. It wasn't automated. Someone had left it behind, knowing one of us would eventually stumble across it. I asked Erin what came next. He just pointed to the relay logs. My name had been pinged again. This time tagged as disruptive.
Not dangerous, not hostile, just disruptive.
But in systems like this, disruption was enough. I closed the notebook and stood. "Then we need to disrupt louder." Erin nodded, grim but ready. We weren't just trying to survive now. We were going to break the loop. Not for fame, not for followers, for the truth. Even if no one believed it, even if no one was left to hear it. We launched the signal from a maintenance hub buried beneath the city's flood controls. It was outside standard network maps, built before full system integration, obsolete by today's specs, but perfect for what we needed. Erin coded the payload by hand, embedding a series of visual keys into an old racing highlight, masking truth inside entertainment. It was my last stream, but not from me. We'd spliced deepfake overlays into my voice and face, subtle tweaks that drifted just off pattern, enough to slip under content monitors without triggering deletion. The real message lived in the frames, a fractal pulse, readable only by viewers trained to notice inconsistency, encoded to awaken suspicion, not belief. We weren't proving the truth. We were planting doubt. Once the file was ready, Erin routed it through an abandoned ad node, still linked to the central traffic boards. We chose a busy time when people were scrolling, not thinking. The clip auto-played on feeds across 4 sectors before the filters caught it. 47 seconds of audio-visual static layered with racing noise, facial glitches, and spiral overlays. Some dismissed it as a prank. Others tagged it as corrupted content. But a few, just enough, started asking questions. The post was banned within the hour. Mirror sites crashed. Comments froze. Then came the wipe. By nightfall, every trace of the video was gone. But not before we saw the ripple. Encrypted forums lit up. Fragments got re-uploaded as memes. Someone mirrored the spectrogram and found our encoded phrase, "This is not weather." The system reacted fast, an automated scrub, followed by search suppression, but the data was already leaking. Our burn protocol had worked. Erin called it the crack in the glass. I didn't celebrate. Neither did he. The truth wasn't safe now. It was targeted. And so were we. Erin dismantled the rig in silence, scattering pieces across old cache sites and burner nodes. We couldn't stay. The city had eyes again. Before we split, he handed me a drive, cold, unmarked, and untraceable. "This one doesn't just disrupt," he said. It redirects. I asked where. He smiled, just slightly. Somewhere the loop can't
follow.
Then he vanished into the tunnels, leaving me above ground, alone and off script for the first time in my life. I left the city before sunrise. No farewell post, no digital trail. Just a dead sim and an old bike I found near a drainage lot. The streets looked the same, but they felt different, flattened, like scenery in a simulation, no longer tracking my presence. Billboards still flashed my likeness, pushing products I'd never endorsed. People watched, but their eyes slid past me. I wasn't part of the program anymore. I was background noise. And for the first time that felt like power. I rode west, sticking to back roads and service lanes. At night, I slept under overpasses the cold drive Erin gave me, tucked inside my jacket like a second spine. I didn't open it, not yet. I didn't need to. I knew what it was, the final cut. A package loaded with raw footage, satellite timestamps and decrypted overlays, the kind of evidence you couldn't unsee once it found you. But this time, we weren't uploading it. We were seeding it. Distributed drops, piggybacked on private nodes, rerouted through forgotten infrastructure. No central stream, no influencer boost, just a slow leak into the cracks. By the end of the second week, I reached a coastal settlement. No towers, no feeds, just wind and water and silence that didn't hum with background code. I found a small uplink station built into the cliffside, analog relays, manual switches, and a signal just strong enough to push a pulse across legacy mesh. I slid the drive into the console and set the sequence. A cascade of data lit up the terminal, clean and precise. Then I locked the panel and stepped away. No fanfare, no broadcast, just release. I stood outside as the sky shifted overhead. No spirals. Just real clouds, moving like the weather used to. For a moment, I felt weightless. Not from victory, but from clarity. Zephyr would adapt. The loop always does. But now, somewhere out there, people were seeing the patterns. Not all at once, not even clearly, but enough to question. And sometimes that's all it takes. I walked down to the shoreline and watched. The tide come in. My name didn't matter anymore. My stream was done. But the signal was still out there, moving without me, and that, finally, was freedom. If it's just weather, why does the air taste different? I didn't believe in chemtrails, or at least I didn't until the sky stopped making sense. You'd think as an astrophysicist I'd be more open to fringe theories, but data has a way of keeping your feet on the ground. My name's Mara Ellison. I run satellite climate models for an institute that prides itself on staying out of politics. So when a defense liaison called asking for a quiet consult on an atmospheric reading that looked off, I assumed it would be a bad calibration or some regional pollution spike. What I found was harder to explain. Over Iceland's air corridor, one of the busiest transatlantic routes, sat a dense band of particulates, harmless enough at first glance, until the isotopic ratios came back wrong. Carbon-14 signatures that didn't match any known industrial byproduct. Traces of something, heavier, almost synthetic. It didn't fit. I flagged it for escalation and went back to work. But the samples kept coming. Same anomaly, different locations, grid patterns intersecting jet routes with coordinated timing. Still, I told myself it was a coincidence, atmospheric spillover from some classified propulsion test, maybe. It wasn't my business until I got an encrypted file from Peter, a friend from grad school turned aerospace consultant. "You need to see this," he said. But the video cut out halfway through. His signal dropped, then his phone went dark. The next morning, I found out he'd gone missing, mid-interview with a climate journalist. I traced the last data packet he sent me. It was titled Xenoform Initiative, just that. No context, no explanation. But once I opened it, I understood what scared him. It wasn't about poison, it wasn't about war. It was a controlled environmental conversion, long-term, global and surgical. The shift wasn't killing us outright. It was phasing us out. Replacing oxygen-rich zones with trace compounds tailored to something else, something that doesn't need what we breathe. And if the air was being changed, that meant someone, or something, could already live here. I didn't sleep that night, and I haven't really slept since. The file wasn't just theory, it was logistics, flight schedules, chemical payload inventories, layered meteorological overlays cross-referenced with military airspace patterns. Whoever compiled it had access well above clearance level. I isolated one segment, a global distribution map spanning 2 decades, showing incremental shifts in atmospheric composition. The changes were subtle enough to avoid public scrutiny, but precise enough to indicate intent. That's when I noticed the timing. Every spike in particulate density corresponded to heavy traffic from specific aerospace carriers, companies with quiet government contracts and no public-facing operations. One of them matched Peter's last employer. I tried logging into our university's secure climate database to compare satellite readings. My credentials had been revoked. No warning, no explanation. Just a blank login screen and a polite error message. Then came the interference. My climate models began to glitch, not crash, just distort. Output data flipped units, swapped decimal placements, ran incongruous projections that failed basic checks. At first, I thought it was internal corruption, but the anomalies were too targeted. Someone was altering the output before I even saw it. That's when I stopped working from the lab. I moved my operations offline, using an air-gapped laptop, with local climate readings from remote sensors. I needed untouched data, something no one else could manipulate. One night, while reviewing wind shear patterns over Central Asia, I spotted an anomaly. Low-altitude turbulence shifts that didn't match terrain or weather models. It looked like a ventilation system, controlled diffusion in vast atmospheric pockets. And then, beneath the thermal imaging layer, I saw something stranger. Structures. Not visible in optical wavelengths, not natural. Suspended above jet corridors like scaffolding or filtration grids. I couldn't prove they were there, but the residual heat signatures suggested active processes, cooling mechanisms designed for high-altitude chemical exchange. I didn't tell anyone. I just packed a bag, destroyed my network drives, and drove out of the city. On the radio, there was a report of a respiratory outbreak along the Gulf Coast, symptoms mimicking altitude sickness at sea level. Officials blamed mold exposure. But I'd seen the air maps, I knew what it was. The transition wasn't coming. It had already started. I drove for 2 days without stopping for more than fuel. No calls, no internet, just a stack of printed data, my encrypted backups, and the growing sense that I wasn't alone. The air changed the farther I got from the cities. It was cooler, thinner, like the oxygen itself was retreating. By the time I reached the Colorado Highlands, I could feel it in my chest. Tightness, not altitude sickness, but something heavier, more deliberate. I stayed in a cabin owned by a retired NOAA technician I knew from an old symposium. He owed me a favor and didn't ask questions. There, I booted up the drone footage Peter had hidden inside a mislabeled zip archive. What I saw made everything else feel small. High above the Arctic Circle, the drone had captured a refueling rig, unregistered, hovering just below radar range. Its arms extended outward in a hexagonal array, each nozzle spraying a fine mist into the upper atmosphere. The footage cut to black after 7 minutes, but in the last frame there was a logo I recognized. Not a company, not a nation, just a circle intersected by 3 lines, the same mark etched into a contract I'd seen years ago while consulting for a defense contractor. Back then I thought it was just internal shorthand. Now I knew it was something else. I went looking for someone who might have answers. That led me to Samir, a former Air Force meteorologist who'd been forced out after publishing a classified weather pattern analysis without approval. He lived off-grid, deep in the Rockies, and I had to hike the last mile to reach him. When I showed him the footage, he didn't look surprised. "It's not for us," he said calmly. "We're not the intended audience anymore." He handed me a printed set of coordinates and a warning. "Whatever you're planning, don't go alone. They're not protecting the skies, they're preparing them." That night, the cabin's power cut out for 12 minutes. No storm, no grid failure, just darkness and the low, rhythmic pulse of something flying high overhead, leaving no trail behind. I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching the stars fade behind a ceiling of artificial clouds. The coordinates Samir gave me led to an abandoned weather station on the edge of a restricted zone near the Utah-Nevada border. Getting there required a falsified permit and a 4-hour detour to avoid active military checkpoints. The stations had been offline for years, officially decommissioned after a fire, but the structure was intact and inside the equipment had been gutted and replaced. What I found wasn't weather gear. It was a relay node, military-grade transmitters, climate sensors, calibrated for upper atmosphere dispersion, and a satellite. Uplink still faintly warm. Someone had been there recently. I copied the drive logs and scanned the broadcast history. The node had been sending atmospheric data to a private orbital platform registered to a shell company based in São Tomé. The transmissions were short, always the same size, always encrypted. But when I isolated the packet headers, a pattern emerged. Location tags matching aerosol release events I'd tracked months ago. It wasn't just monitoring, it was coordination. These platforms were watching global air composition and adapting the dispersion schedule in real time. Terraforming wasn't a side effect, it was the mission. I backed up the data and pulled the battery to kill the uplink. Minutes later, I heard a low hum, the kind that doesn't vibrate the air but the ground beneath your feet. I moved fast, out the back entrance, and into a dry ravine where my rental was hidden under a thermal blanket. Above me, a sleek aircraft circled once, before vanishing into cloud cover that hadn't been there an hour earlier. It left no exhaust trail, no sound after the initial pass. Only a faint, metallic scent in the air, one I'd come to recognize. That night, I drove through the desert with my lights off, guided by GPS and instinct. I sent the logs to a secure node run by a rogue AI researcher I'd once collaborated with in Berlin. He didn't respond, but I knew he got them. The next day, his lab was destroyed in a drone strike blamed on a faulty lithium battery. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was protocol, and it was accelerating. I kept moving west, changing cars twice and using burner phones I never kept longer than a day. The further I got from population centers, the more stable the air felt. In the high desert, I could breathe without tightness, without the faint pressure I'd grown used to near cities. But isolation came at a cost. Supplies ran low. Information grew sparse. My only contact was an encrypted forum used by a coalition of former defense analysts, climate scientists, and disavowed AI engineers. They called themselves Null Array, quiet, precise, and always watching. I posted a fragment of the relay logs under a known cipher. Within hours, I had a reply. Coordinates, timestamp, and a single word: proof. I followed the location to an old weather balloon facility in eastern Oregon, long since shut down. The building was crumbling, overgrown, but below ground it was something else entirely. The basement was cold, dry, and powered by an independent generator, humming softly in the dark. Inside were server racks running silently, their fans barely audible. A projector displayed looping footage, aircraft releasing faint mist trails, almost invisible unless filtered through infrared. The timestamps matched Peter's data exactly, but the real discovery was on a secured terminal, protected by biometric lock. They had anticipated someone like me. A sticky note left neatly on the desk read, "Ellison will know what to do." I used Peter's old passphrase, one he used during our early research days. The lock clicked open. The files inside were different. Not data, not projections, communications, internal memos, call transcripts, and contractor invoices, traded, not for currency, but for biological exemptions, quiet deals for small populations in isolated highlands, places that would retain viable oxygen levels longer than the rest of the world. The plan wasn't extermination, it was selective preservation. The atmosphere was being recalibrated to accommodate a different biology, but a fraction of humans would remain as samples or co-inhabitants. I stared at the screen for a long time. These weren't monsters planning our extinction. They were managers preparing for coexistence, only we didn't get a vote. The next file was a flight plan. Destination: Lhasa. Altitude: 17,000 feet. I knew what I had to do. I crossed into Tibet under a fabricated academic visa, using credentials from a university that hadn't existed in 5 years. The altitude hit me fast. My breathing grew shallow, and the pressure in my head built with every step. But the air, dry, sharp, and strangely clean, felt untouched. Lhasa was quiet under the morning sun, the streets still damp from melted frost. I kept to the outer quarters, avoiding cameras, staying near the monastery routes where tourists still passed unnoticed. The flight plan had listed a point 20 kilometers north of the city, deep into terrain few traveled without purpose. I arranged transport with a local who asked no questions. By the second day, roads gave way to rock paths. Then only foot trails remained. At night, the sky opened wider than I'd ever seen it. No haze, no glare, just cold clarity and stars that didn't flicker. I reached the ridge at dawn. There, buried in stone, was a weathered sensor array, long dormant, at least officially. I powered it using a portable inverter and waited. Within minutes, it came alive, uploading its cache to my handheld. What it showed was impossible. The local atmosphere here had stabilized. Oxygen levels had not only resisted the global decline, they'd
Risen slightly. The composition wasn't reverting. It was being shielded. Something or someone had carved out a preserve, a pocket of atmosphere still tailored to humans.
As I studied the readings, I felt it for the first time in months. Air that filled my lungs without resistance, without that faint, synthetic burn. I dropped my mask and breathed deeply. And in that moment, I understood. The planet wasn't dying. It was being edited. And here, in the thin shelter of ancient mountains, was the control group. Not everything was meant to be erased. Some of us were being measured, observed. I sent the full data set to Null Array. Within minutes, their response came through. Reconfigure the drones, target the grid. The plan had changed. It wasn't just about exposure anymore, it was about interference. If we couldn't stop the terraforming, we had to overwrite it. One signal at a time. I packed my gear and prepared for the descent. The war for the sky had just begun. Peter had warned me years ago. He once said, half joking, that any system you don't fully control is one day going to be used against you. I didn't understand what he meant until I rewrote it. Not from scratch, just enough to bend the system back. The drones were already in place, seeded over the years as part of academic climate monitoring programs, civilian air quality trackers, and weather insurance protocols. What Null Array had done quietly, over time, was install control logic, backdoors buried beneath firmware updates that no one ever questioned. The code was mine now, not to destroy but to recalibrate. The target was clear: disrupt the atmospheric. Adaptation Directive, a multilateral program buried under decades of false climate research and defense contracts. The International Atmospheric Symposium was the moment. Every major player, civilian, military and industrial, was watching. I parked outside Geneva in a van running a mobile relay node tied into Null Array's satellite uplink. We'd cracked the livestream protocol weeks ago. I waited for the keynote to begin. Then I triggered the cut. The broadcast stuttered. The screen went black. And then I appeared, my face calm and unfiltered, on every monitor in every room. My name is Dr. Mara Ellison. You've been lied to. I revealed the isotopic drift models, the adapted chemical dispersion logs. I listed flight numbers, launch sites, subcontractor codes. I showed the preserved oxygen zones, the living vaults hidden in high-altitude regions for a select few. Then I released the full archive, all of it. Not through media outlets, but through academic open-access repositories mirrored on every continent. As the broadcast ended, the drones engaged. We hadn't weaponized them, we'd reprogrammed them to pulse interference across the grid, shortwave bursts that scrambled dispersion signals and reset chemical diffusion rates to pre-AAD baselines. Within hours, telemetry changed. Air began to clear in segments, erratic but real. The pressure shifted. By nightfall, multiple governments issued emergency investigations. The directives network collapsed under the weight of exposure. It wasn't over, but it was fractured, and that was enough. I disappeared after that. No more broadcasts, no
interviews, just the sound of the wind at altitude, clean and sharp. I wasn't just trying to survive anymore, I was trying to breathe without permission.
It wasn't the sneezing that worried me. It was how it always happened, in the same place, at the same time, to people who'd never met. I used to joke about allergy season being my busy season, the way accountants talk about April. But this year was different. In the clinic, my schedule was filled with the same complaints: itchy eyes, wheezing, fatigue. It was textbook stuff, but the timing wasn't. Patients who lived miles apart came in with identical symptoms on identical days, despite
radically different pollen forecasts.
I brushed it off at first. Pollen doesn't follow rules, and neither does the body. Then came the Bellevue case. A 5-year-old boy, Julian, with a clean history and a brand new inhaler his mum never had to use, until he collapsed during recess. In one of the new BioNexus green zones, a playground touted as certified allergen controlled. I reviewed his chart twice, then checked the zone's air report. 0 allergens, perfect air quality, BioNexus certified. So why was Julian intubated? I started mapping out where my patients were coming from, color-coding outbreaks by date and severity. What emerged wasn't a scatter plot, it was a trail. A curved path that matched nothing on the allergy forecast, but aligned exactly with a flight route into LaGuardia. I remember staring at the map, that prickly sensation crawling up my arms, the kind you get when someone taps the glass from the other side. Didn't make sense, so I dug deeper. The more I asked around, the more I felt eyes turn cautious. Co-workers smiled too quickly. People used to vent about the city's air like clockwork, but now they quoted BioNexus slogans like they meant them. Breath is a choice. Choose better. It sounded like marketing at first, until I saw it etched on the side of a hospital inhaler cabinet. Something was off. The air had changed, and not in a metaphorical way. I just didn't know yet that someone had turned it into a business model, a quiet, selective one, with consequences. I started collecting screenshots, flight paths, pollen maps, ER admission spikes, anything that might explain why entire blocks were sneezing in unison while nearby neighborhoods stayed silent. My apartment looked like a crime scene. Red string, taped up maps, a spreadsheet open on every screen. The data wasn't subtle. Respiratory events surged under specific flight corridors, especially low-altitude routes near dense residential areas. Meanwhile, upscale zones with concierge healthcare and BioNexus wellness centers reported 0 incidents, even during peak allergy periods. I tried to bring it up at work carefully during a staff meeting. Has anyone else noticed an uptick in cases that don't match the pollen count? I asked, casually flipping through my patient log. Blank stares, then one of the senior nurses offered a forced smile and said, I think we're all just adjusting to climate unpredictability. BioNexus says we're entering a transitional air phase. Transitional air phase? That wasn't medical language, it was marketing copy. I knew because I'd seen the same phrase on a banner hanging over a new BioNexus clinic 2 blocks from my building. The next morning, I found my personal email had been locked. Not hacked, just blank. No inbox, no folders, no data. I contacted support. The rep told me there was no record of my account. I tried logging into the clinic's system. Same issue. The credentials worked, but the interface loaded with a message I'd never seen before. Access privileges under review. Please contact your compliance officer. I didn't have a compliance officer. That afternoon, I overheard two colleagues in the break room talking about my adjustment period. One of them used my name, followed by a phrase I'd never heard out loud. Non-aligned status. I left early, heart pounding, and walked straight to the emergency department at a different hospital across town. One outside the BioNexus network. I posed as a visiting researcher and asked for anonymized ER data from the last 3 months. They gave me an export. It confirmed what I already knew. Cases followed the spray patterns like shadows under a moving sun. I was watching a controlled exposure program unfold in real time. And the people who didn't pay? They were the control group. I started waking up at odd hours with a sense that something was listening. Not watching, listening. My phone would glitch for half a second. Every time I opened a new app and my browser auto-completed searches I'd never typed. At first, I thought I was just tired, overworked. But then an alert popped up on my laptop that wasn't from any program I recognized. It blinked once, then vanished. Compliance level mismatch detected. Reset recommended. I didn't click anything. I shut the machine down and pulled the battery out. That night, I stayed offline. In the morning, a sealed envelope slid under my apartment door. Inside was a formal offer from BioNexus, promotion to Regional Respiratory Coordinator, full benefits, 6-figure salary, and access to their proprietary treatment tier. All I had to do was sign the attached waiver. It didn't even pretend to be subtle. The waiver included language about data sharing, adaptive participation, and an indemnity clause if treatment outcomes varied from expectations. At the bottom, in faint grey print, by signing, participant acknowledges the presence of environmental conditioning factors within the general population and agrees to refrain from public disclosure. I didn't sign. I scanned the document, shredded it, and flushed the pieces. 2 days later, my certification number was flagged in the National Provider Registry. I couldn't prescribe, consult, or even log into hospital systems. A flagged practitioner is one step above a revoked license, but worse in some ways because you're still visible, just untrusted. I went to the credentialing board in person. They said my status had changed due to a risk-based classification.
Adjustment. When I asked what that meant, the woman at the desk stared at her monitor for a long moment, then said, "Your case is currently under compliance audit.
Please wait for further instruction." She didn't look at me once. I walked out with no answers and nowhere to work. That night, I received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was quiet, tired, and direct. "You're not crazy, and you're not alone. If you want proof, real proof, meet me tomorrow, 9 a.m., Bethesda Library basement. Don't bring your phone." Then the line went dead. The basement smelled like paper and copper piping. Old water stains marked the ceiling tiles, and a humming radiator clicked in steady intervals. I found him in the far corner, behind a rusted utility shelf stacked with discarded microfilm reels. Mid-50s, lean, in a threadbare windbreaker with nicotine-stained fingers. He didn't introduce himself. "They call it stratified immunity," he said, handing me a small drive sealed in a plastic sleeve. "Controlled exposure, activated, suppression, that's the model. BioNexus built the tech under a DARPA grant, then privatized it." I kept my hands in my coat pockets. "How does it work?" He pointed to a schematic in the folder he laid on the table. It showed a microscopic structure, engineered particulates with histamine receptors, pressure sensitive. They spray a base layer over wide areas, dormant, harmless until they trigger it with a secondary compound, usually something tied to altitude or heat flux. The rich get the antidote, everyone else gets the reaction. I flipped through the pages. Internal memos, patent filings, purchase orders, routed through shell companies, everything dated within the last 2 years. "And the antihistamines?" I asked. "Biometric locked, your saliva, your blood type. They designed them so they only neutralize the synthetic triggers if you're a registered user. It's not medication, it's access." I looked at him. "Why hasn't anyone said anything?" He laughed under his breath. "Some tried. One woman, pulmonary nurse from Tampa, figured it out last spring, dead in a car fire. 2 others disappeared mid-shift. No trace, no investigation. People think they're paranoid. And once BioNexus flags your digital ID, even your grocery receipts, stop syncing. You become noise." He leaned forward. "You still have a platform that won't last. If you want to fight back, there's one option left." He slid a second folder across the table. Inside was a blueprint for a handheld filtration device, rough but clever, a bioscrubber. He said it could neutralize the triggers on contact, no subscription needed. Build it, test it, release it open source. That's the only way this ends, not with a whistle, but with a workaround. I didn't say yes. I just took the folder and walked out. It was already raining. I stayed offline for 3 weeks. No phone, no email, no logins. I paid in cash, moved apartments, and used a borrowed ID to check out textbooks from university libraries. The bioscrubber design was sound. Simple chemistry, clever airflow control, and a layered filter stack made from materials anyone could source with effort. But I couldn't build it alone. I needed tools, clean space, and people I could trust. That's when I found the forum. Buried behind 4 proxies and a broken login page was a discussion thread titled "Air Isn't Free Anymore." It wasn't much, 30 users, mostly inactive. But one handle caught my eye. Reticle Medic. I recognized the alias from a whistleblower brief I'd read in the folder. Former BioNexus systems engineer, vanished mid-2024. I sent a single message. "I have the scrubber plans. Need help prototyping." 2 days later, I was in a basement. Workshop on the edge of Baltimore, staring at a 3D printer surrounded by salvaged circuit boards and air quality meters. Reticle Medic was a woman in her early 40s with short hair, a permanent scowl, and no time for small talk. "You're
"Late?" she said, handing me nitrile gloves. "We worked for 16 hours straight."
I handled the airflow calibration while she printed a microcontroller housing that could spoof biometric signals. So the scrubber wouldn't just clean the air, it would also trick the triggers into staying dormant. We finished a working prototype by sunrise. It was ugly. Bare circuitry, visible tape seams, an exposed battery pack. But it worked. We ran tests using air samples taken from 4 zones across the city. Triggered particulates lost reactivity within seconds of passing through the device. I stared at the readout for a long time. "So this is it?" I asked. "It's enough," she said. "Now we need people." She handed me a new folder, thinner this time, names, locations, burned contacts, and a few medics who'd been flagged and blacklisted like me. "They've already lost jobs. They have nothing to protect. That's who builds the network." I nodded, though part of me still expected the ceiling to cave in. The next move wasn't exposure. It was a replication. Let the truth spread the way air does, everywhere. We moved in pieces, quiet and wide. The first 10 scrubbers were built in a shuttered school lab outside Philly, untraceable parts, hand-assembled, no digital record. We dropped them off one by one, sealed in unmarked mailers, routed through co-ops and shelters. Each recipient got a thumb drive with a full blueprint, instructions, and a contact code. We called it version 0. Within a month, 20 more appeared, unrequested. The design had already mutated. Some added better seals, others attached belt clips or solar packs. The open source model worked. We didn't need mass production, we just needed to spark it. That's when I got a ping from someone using my old medical alias LMuirRX. I'd abandoned that handle months ago. The message was short. "They're launching the Omega patch tomorrow. High-impact AR event. You want to stop this? That's the window." No signature, just coordinates and a timestamp. It was Midtown, the BioNexus Dome, their new flagship wellness hub. I'd seen it under construction, a mirrored egg wedged between glass towers, pulsing with soft green light. The event was public. Augmented reality livestream, gamified breathing, stats, influencers, everywhere. The Omega patch was supposed to be their breakthrough, adhesive tech with a built-in histamine modulator that could be calibrated in real time. I didn't believe it at first. Then I saw the marketing. Every breath is verified. Every immune response is optimized. They were selling air obedience. Reticle Medic handled the breach. She coded a drop-in for their AR stream, just long enough to flash our findings. Not theories, proof. Internal memos, trials without consent.
ER records cross-tagged with customer profiles. I was the one who had to flip the switch.
We timed it for the peak of the launch, 3:42 p.m., when their feed reached 500,000 viewers. I stood on the edge of the crowd with a patched scrubber clipped under my coat. No one noticed me. When I triggered the stream injection, the dome's feed shimmered once, then cut to black. For 6 seconds the truth filled every visor, phone, and wearable on site. Then the signal snapped back. Silence fell over the crowd. No one screamed. No one clapped. It was the kind of silence that marks the moment before something breaks. The fallout didn't come all at once. It rippled, delays, denials, then quiet. Admissions buried beneath language like unauthorized deployment variants. BioNexus scrubbed the Omega Patch campaign within 24 hours. The dome was closed for technical evaluation. But the video had already escaped. Someone had screen captured the 6-second drop, slowed it frame by frame, and posted it with annotations. It spread like vapor, fast, invisible, and impossible to contain. The story fractured along expected lines. Some called it a hoax, others claimed it was a marketing stunt. But in clinics, the questions started. Parents brought in kids with sudden reactions and asked about particulates. Tech workers began disabling biometric permissions on their medication profiles. A few hospitals quietly removed BioNexus devices from their intake rooms. The truth didn't start a revolution. It started a doubt. That was enough. I didn't go back to work. There was no work to go back to. My name was still flagged, still grey-listed in the databases. But through the network, I stayed busy. We improved the scrubber, pushed the design into a sealed unit, wrote it up in 6 languages. Every time one was downloaded, we got a ping. Thousands, then tens of thousands. We'd made the antidote free, and that made the model fall apart. BioNexus didn't collapse, not publicly. They restructured, rebranded, and blamed a rogue division. But their air zones emptied, their subscriptions
Stored.
and their silence said what no press release could. They'd lost control. I don't live in the city anymore. I moved north, near the edge of the tree line, where the air still carries the scent of actual pine. No sensors, no modulation, just breath. I still check the feed sometimes, not out of fear, but to see who's downloading. To see who else decided to stop waiting for permission to survive. I never set out to fight a system. I just wanted the air to stop hurting people. But once I understood the design, I knew there was no going back. Now, when I see someone wearing a scrubber in a crowd, clipped quietly to their coat like mine once was, I don't feel pride. I feel proof. Proof that survival isn't compliance. It's refusal. They called it the most important trial in modern history. I thought it was a publicity stunt. The air in the federal courthouse was stale, scrubbed by the same recycled vents that hummed overhead like a distant threat. I sat in the narrow confines of the jury box, a notepad in my lap, my pen already out of ink. Juror La 7, Maya Lin. Once a biomedical researcher, now a freelance science journalist, without health insurance or institutional ties. I told myself I was only here to observe from inside, nothing more. The plaintiff's claim was outrageous, that the US government had knowingly conducted covert aerial chemical dispersals over American cities, causing long-term illness and death. Chemtrails, they used to call them. I laughed the first time I saw it on the docket. But something shifted the moment the lead attorney for the plaintiffs rolled in a mobile cart stacked with redacted documents, thick, creased, and real. Opening, arguments were dry despite the stakes. The DOJ leaned hard into the phrase pseudo-scientific hysteria. They mocked the plaintiff's reliance on anecdotal symptoms and misinterpreted weather patterns. But as each day passed, the plaintiffs chipped away at that wall. The testimony of retired meteorologists, maps correlating chemical density with rising autoimmune rates, medical case studies. Still, I remained skeptical. There were always explanations, environmental factors, genetic predispositions, random clusters. I scribbled down questions in the margins of my pad I never intended to ask. Then came day 4. The courtroom's AV system flickered to life with a leaked internal memo from a private defense contractor. The logo, Stratoshield. My pen froze mid-sentence. The memo discussed geoengineering dispersal zones and referenced terms like behavioral compliance drift and neurological threshold modulation. Vague, but troubling. Even the presiding judge seemed momentarily jarred before calling a recess. I watched the defense team whisper furiously. Something wasn't going to plan. And I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow we were no longer just jurors, we were subjects, unwitting and sealed inside a controlled box. By the end of that day, the live stream had hit 20 million viewers, and the nosebleeds began. The first juror to bleed was number 3, a young man with an engineering background and a habit of tapping his pen when nervous. It happened during the cross-examination of a former CDC analyst. The witness, pale and visibly shaking, had just begun to describe internal conflict over a memo she'd tried to redact, one that mentioned exposure thresholds for civilian populations during atmospheric testing. Mid-sentence, the juror's pen clattered to the floor. He cupped his nose, startled, and when he pulled his hand away, it was slick with blood. There was a beat of silence, then chaos. Bailiffs moved fast, paramedics were summoned, cameras zoomed in. The live stream didn't cut. It couldn't. All feeds were mandated to stay uninterrupted under federal transparency law. By nightfall, 3 more jurors had reported headaches and tremors. I felt fine, but I was watching myself more closely than usual, testing the steadiness of my fingers, checking my eyes in the restroom mirror for signs of hemorrhage. I tried to reassure myself. Stress. Poor air quality. Coincidence. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The next morning, none of us were allowed to leave. A brief announcement from a man in a charcoal suit informed us of a temporary biohazard containment protocol. We would be sequestered in private hotel rooms monitored by federal medical staff. It was said like it was routine, like this happened all the time in high-profile trials. The elevators to the lobby were disabled. Our phones were already in secure storage per protocol. I heard juror number 9 mutter something about martial law. She wasn't far off. That night, I used the jury room's desktop computer to access the courthouse Wi-Fi. The internet worked, but it was filtered. I ran a ping test. 3 attempts returned errors. DNS routing was local only. We weren't just cut off, we were boxed in. The next day, the CDC witness collapsed on the stand. Blood from her eyes.
Nose, ears, it soaked the microphone. The judge didn't recess. He sat stone-faced as paramedics wheeled her out. No ruling, no statement, just silence.
I stared at him and thought, either he was in shock, or he already knew this was coming. Either way, the courtroom wasn't safe anymore. And whatever was in the air, we were all breathing it. By the 3rd week, none of us trusted the air. A humming sound, subtle at first, had started pulsing through the jury chambers. It wasn't loud, but it was constant, like a distant machine you could feel more than hear. I asked one of the guards what it was. He smiled like I was imagining things, but I wasn't the only one hearing it. Juror number 5, a retired electrician, pointed to the ceiling vents and said, "That's not HVAC," no one argued. We kept our voices low. Everyone felt watched. The symptoms weren't consistent. Some had tremors, others hallucinations. A few of us still felt normal or close to it, but the paranoia had started to spread faster than the illness. Juror Nuct 11 accused Marshafor of being a plant. They almost fought during a recess. The bailiffs didn't intervene, just stood there, hands at, their sides, eyes blank. I started noticing other patterns. The air filters had been changed 3 times in 1 week, always during odd hours. I found a maintenance tag taped to the inside of the chamber door. Schedule contractor. Install Drex 17. I remembered the memo from StratoShield. Drex was one of the listed chemical dispersal agents. I waited until lights out to move. The courthouse security system was modern, but the internal Wi-Fi wasn't. I used a portable keystroke sniffer I'd built in grad school. Never thought I'd use it again. It gave me access to the maintenance login. From there, I traced the service orders. The air upgrades were filed under Emergency Infrastructure Modernization, signed off not by the building's management, but by a contractor tied to the Department of Energy. The files included diagrams, vent placements, flow schematics, chemical logs. Most of it was gibberish unless you had a background in aerosol chemistry. I did. The quantities didn't make sense for filtration, they made sense for dispersal. There were notes referencing neurological load saturation, a term I'd seen once in a DARPA research paper. I felt cold all over. We weren't just being monitored, we were being dosed, slowly, methodically. I closed the files, wiped the cache, and unplugged everything. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. The noise in the vents grew louder, or maybe we just stopped pretending not to hear it. It was Juror 6 who finally cracked. He stood up mid-testimony and shouted that we were being poisoned. No one tried to stop him. His outburst wasn't shocking, it felt overdue. The judge ordered a recess, but the courtroom doors didn't open. We sat there, waiting, while the stenographer slowly packed her equipment and left through a side exit none of us had noticed before. That's when I realized how little control we had. Every movement, every word was on someone else's terms. Even the exits. Back in the jury room, people started comparing symptoms. We kept our voices low, but the mood had changed. Doubt had turned into certainty. Nosebleeds, memory lapses, metallic taste in water, some of it subtle, some unmistakable. I asked if anyone remembered getting physical exams before the trial began. No one did. We had been ushered in quickly, told to sign a few forms, handed IDs and locked into a daily schedule. No checkups, no baselines. I was starting to think that was the point. That night, I confronted one of the attending physicians. He wasn't in a lab coat. He wore a plain grey suit and never gave a last name. I asked who he worked for. He smiled, but didn't answer. When I pushed harder, he told me I was overstimulated and offered a sedative. I declined. Later, when the jury was moved back to our hotel floors, I watched 2 men in coveralls carry a large metal canister through the hallway. It was labelled HVAC Thermal Cleanse Unit. I followed them as far as I could without drawing attention. They stopped outside the jury chamber. 10 minutes later, the noise in the vents changed pitch. The hum now had a pulse, steady, rhythmic, like a low-frequency signal buried in static. That night, I broke into the administrative network again. I found logs referencing a protocol called Cognitive Containment, Phase 2. The description was vague, but mentioned behavior modeling, chemical saturation thresholds, and, disturbingly, memory calibration events. I printed what I could and flushed the rest. The printer jammed twice. Each jam felt like a countdown. I slid the documents under the mattress in my room. If anything happened, at least there'd be something left behind, something real. something undeniable. By morning, one of the jurors was gone. Juror number 10, an older woman who had been quiet, but observant, was simply missing. Her bed hadn't been slept in. Her clothes were still folded on the chair. The court's liaison claimed she'd been transferred for medical reasons, but no details were offered. No ambulance had come. No personnel had signed her out. She was just erased. It changed everything. The mood in the jury room wasn't fear anymore. It was resistance. I called for a vote. Not about the case, but about us. We had a choice: continue pretending this was a fair trial, or stop cooperating until outside medical professionals were allowed in. No more questions. No more deliberation, just silence. Juror number 3 objected at first, said we were overreacting. But even he had developed tremors by then. His hand shook when he reached for the water pitcher. Eventually, everyone agreed. When the court reconvened that afternoon, we didn't rise. We didn't speak. The judge waited. The cameras kept rolling. After 30 minutes of silence, the prosecution requested a private meeting. The judge agreed. We were escorted out, but not back to our rooms. Instead, we were placed in a conference room with no windows and no clocks, no phones, just guards and water. We waited 6 hours. When they returned, everything had changed. The Department of Justice issued a formal statement on the live stream. Third-party doctors would be brought in. Viewers cheered online. It felt like a win, but it wasn't. I recognized one of the arriving physicians, Dr. Emery, a fringe actor, from a pharmaceutical training video I'd fact-checked years ago. His resume was fabricated. I checked again on a hidden laptop I'd stashed under floorboards in the jury suite. Every doctor brought in had no verifiable credentials. The strike hadn't worked. It had made us more vulnerable. We weren't guests of the court anymore. We were assets in an experiment, contained, monitored, and manipulated. That night, someone slid a folded piece of paper under my door. No signature. Just 5 words scrawled in shaky ink. Look into Operation Mirage. I stared at it for a long time, realizing the strike hadn't revealed the truth. It had triggered the next phase. I waited until the early hours to search. The guards rotated every 4 hours, and the one station near my room had a habit of stepping away for coffee. At 2:15 a.m. I slipped into the hallway barefoot, careful not to let the door lock behind me. The jury suite's shared printer sat in a supply room behind a false wall. I pried the panel open, retrieved my hidden laptop, and reconnected to the local network. The Wi-Fi signal was weak, but I only needed a keyword. Operation Mirage. It wasn't in any court files or legal databases, not by name, but buried in a misfiled maintenance report I found a broken link that led to a cached server mirror. The domain was government-issued but outdated. It housed only one document. No title, no author, just a coded transcript. It described an initiative launched in 1997 under the Joint Atmospheric Research Directive. The goal wasn't weather control, it was cognitive calibration, using aerosolized compounds to trigger specific neurological effects. Not just hallucinations, memory, distortion, behavior drift, perception control. The protocol described exactly what we were experiencing: sensory anomalies, fragmented recall, temporal dislocation, all under the guise of courtroom containment. Each juror's reaction was being logged. Our thoughts weren't just monitored, they were being shaped. The program had a testing window, 3 weeks. We were on day 21. I printed the transcript and slid it into the stack under my mattress. Then I sent encrypted copies to 3 contacts, old colleagues I hadn't spoken to in years. I knew it would flag me, but it didn't matter. The world had to know. By morning, the jury room was different. Everyone looked exhausted, shadows under their eyes, voices slower, words uncertain. Someone asked what day it was. No one answered. I realized then that the trial didn't need a verdict. We weren't here to decide anything. We were the data. At lunch, the ventilation system cycled twice in 1 hour. The noise was louder this time. A low frequency that made my molars ache. I pressed my hand to the table, trying to stay grounded. I felt the floor vibrate beneath me. That night, the courtroom lights flickered, and reality didn't come back the same. I stopped trusting my own memories 2 days before the trial collapsed. It wasn't just disorientation, it was the gaps, entire conversations that others remembered differently. Juror number 8 claimed I'd asked her about her symptoms the night before. I hadn't spoken to her in days. Juror number 4 swore he'd watched me tear up documents in the jury
room. I hadn't printed anything that day. We weren't just losing time, we were losing alignment with ourselves.
Something in the room, in the air, was rewriting us. That morning, I made a decision. I went back to the maintenance server and traced the contractor ID linked to the air system. It led to a satellite uplink station buried under the courthouse, part of an older communication relay center decommissioned in the early 2000s. The hallway leading there was unguarded, hidden behind a wall of stacked supply crates. I waited until a fire alarm test caused a brief evacuation of staff. Then I moved. The basement was silent. No cameras, no movement. Just the hum of old machines still running despite being officially retired. I found the uplink console behind, a locked panel. It was dusty, the interface archaic, but operational. I used an external drive I'd hidden inside my shoe to upload everything. The logs, the audio files, the scanned documents, the Operation Mirage transcript. No edits, no commentary, just raw data. I pointed the transmission to open access repositories, encrypted nodes, and a handful of media contacts with auto-release protocols. I didn't expect a miracle. I just wanted the evidence to outlive me. When the upload completed, I disabled the trace function and shut everything down. As I turned to leave, I heard footsteps behind me, measured, unhurried. I didn't run. There was nothing left to hide. Hours later, the trial was declared a mistrial. The courtroom live stream cut without warning. A nationwide technical disruption followed. News anchors scrambled, unsure of what to say. Online, the files spread faster than any narrative could contain them. Some called it a hoax, others recognized the patterns. And then the world split, so I was never seen again. Not officially, but months later a final video surfaced. Grainy, handheld. I was thinner, still calm. They didn't want to hide the truth, I said. They wanted us to normalize it. Then the feed cut. No credits, no timestamp. Just static. The world didn't end, it fractured. After the trial, after the leak, no single narrative took hold. Some called it a psychological
operation.
Others called it the first real evidence of state-sponsored cognitive warfare. Experts debated the files on nightly news shows until they stopped airing altogether. Official agencies offered no response, just silence, broken only by the occasional vague statement about compromise proceedings and ongoing investigations. No charges were filed, no names named, no apologies issued, but something changed. Trust eroded, not all at once, but like rust spreading under paint. Schools revised their civics curricula, courts installed independently monitored ventilation systems. A new wave of journalism emerged, part citizen, part technician, mostly anonymous. They tracked contracts, decrypted metadata, and mapped old government procurement trails. People started noticing how often the language matched. Phrases like resilience modulation and perceptual containment. Mirage wasn't a footnote. It was a framework. Some of the jurors went public, briefly. Juror number 3 gave a shaky interview from an undisclosed location, then disappeared. Juror number 9 posted a 10-part video series before being flagged for mental instability and institutionalized. I watched them quietly from places where my name no longer existed. I had scrubbed my records, left behind every traceable credential, and vanished. Not out of fear, but necessity. The moment I saw how easily the truth could be fragmented, I understood. This wasn't a system that needed to be exposed. It had to be bypassed. Every so often I received messages, encoded, buried in data packets. A phrase from the courtroom, a screen cap from a cached forum. People were connecting dots quietly, carefully. The files I leaked were no longer about one case. They had become something else, a kind of living record, not just of what happened, but of what could. I no longer use the name Maya Lin. That part of me stayed behind in the jury box on day 1. What remained was memory and pattern, fragments of a trial that was never meant to reach a verdict. The real test wasn't the case, it was the reaction. How much people would tolerate, how much they'd forget, and how long they'd wait before they started listening to the hum in their own walls. When climate solutions become weapons of inequality, silence is no longer survival, it's complicity. They said the trails were just condensation. But I've spent 30 years watching the sky, and I know when something stops making sense. Daniel Rios didn't want the assignment. He sat across from his editor, arms folded, waiting for the real pitch to drop. Cloud seeding, she'd said, flipping her tablet around to show him a slideshow of innocuous jets puffing vapor trails above desert landscapes. Feel-good environmental piece, spotlight on tech innovation, quick in and out. He'd nodded along, already drafting an outline in his head, heavy on clichés. Silver iodide, rainfall enhancement, drought relief, science light fluff, something to pad circulation and not ruffle sponsors. But that was before the memo. It came from a source he'd nearly forgotten, Jorge, an ex-airframe inspector who now ran a dive bar in Sao Paulo. The subject line was bare, FYI, no greeting, no commentary. Just a scanned document marked internal use only from a shuttered defense contractor, known more for its bankruptcies than breakthroughs. Daniel almost didn't open it, but he did. And there it was. Stratospheric Aerosol Deployment, Phase 4, Joint Operational Oversight Committee, JOOC, Authorization required prior to non-consensual regional trials. He read it twice, 3 times. Non-consensual. That word stuck. He called Jorge immediately. The line buzzed, then cut. No call back. Daniel stared at the screen until the battery died. That night, he barely slept. The clouds outside his apartment smeared like a watercolor, long streaks of white against an otherwise empty sky. The next morning, he forwarded the file to Naya, a freelancer he'd worked with during the Borneo palm oil investigation. She replied within an hour. "Who else has this?" "Just you," he typed back. She sent an address in Berlin, no further comment. He booked a flight. By the end of the week, Felix Koo, a data analyst from a crowd-sourced climate monitoring group, joined their calls. What began as scattered suspicion started lining up. Archived satellite imagery, discrepancies in airspace logs, anomalous particulate reports from rural observatories, white paper trails leading to real white trails. Overhead, Daniel no longer saw condensation. He saw intent. Berlin was colder than Daniel expected. He stepped off the train at Ostbahnhof, breath clouding in the air, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Naya met him on the platform, her coat zipped to the chin, a knit cap pulled low. She looked different from the last time they'd worked. Together, sharper somehow, more guarded. "You bring the file?" she asked. He nodded. They didn't speak again until they were 3 blocks away from the station, tucked into a quiet cafe with no cameras and no open Wi-Fi. She slid a laptop from her bag and opened a folder labeled F-Trace. Inside were side-by-side comparisons, weather, satellite imagery, flight path overlays, and charts showing elevated barium and sulfur dioxide levels across seemingly random rural areas. "These concentrations," she said, pointing to a heat map of central Mongolia, "don't match any known industrial or volcanic activity, but they do align with gaps in commercial air traffic." Daniel leaned in, noting the thin white arcs traced over global latitudes. "Flight corridors," he said, "but not logged by any civil authority." Naya nodded. "They're flying above regulation altitude, stratosphere, no beacons, no transponders." Felix joined their call from a shared server, his voice clipped by lag. He displayed anonymized drone footage showing a high-altitude aircraft dumping a fine mist. "This wasn't easy to get," he said. "Most of the drones monitoring these zones either vanish or return with corrupted memory." He paused. "I built a workaround. This footage was captured over southern Chile." Daniel watched the video in silence. The aircraft moved like a ghost, barely visible, the substance it released shimmering for a moment before dispersing. "Why would they hide this if it's climate mitigation?" he asked. Naya answered before Felix could. "Because it's not about fixing the climate. It's about managing it for someone." Later that night, back in his hotel room, Daniel scrolled through Felix's data again. The chemical markers weren't just rare, they were restricted, traced to military-grade weather modification projects filed under outdated Cold War initiatives. He shut the laptop and stared at the ceiling. The air outside was silent, but his thoughts were louder than ever. Something was moving above them, and it wasn't condensation, it was strategy. And someone wanted it kept quiet. The trip to Patagonia wasn't part of the plan, but after cross-referencing wind trajectory models with satellite aerosol densities, Felix had flagged a zone near Bariloche where particulate readings spiked outside expected ranges. Naya booked the tickets under aliases and Daniel paid in
cash. They landed under cloudless skies, stepping into dry, cold and thin air.
Their local contact, an environmental scientist named Luis Cardenas, met them at a weather station built into the side of a defunct observatory. This station was mothballed 5 years ago, he explained, as they climbed a narrow stairwell. But some of us kept it running off-grid. We've been tracking anomalies. Inside, the lab smelled of dust and ozone. Luis powered up a terminal and pulled up snowfall samples collected from the nearby peaks. 3 weeks ago, we had a clean snow event. No storms, no industrial influence. Yet the meltwater showed elevated traces of sulfur hexafluoride. Daniel looked at the screen, reading the timestamp and coordinates. This stuff doesn't occur naturally here, he said. Luis nodded. And no source nearby emits it. It's inert but dangerous. A tracer gas, used to monitor air movement or track how a substance disperses. As they reviewed the data, Naya stepped outside for a signal. She returned minutes later, tense. Someone wiped our cloud storage, all of it, backups too. Daniel checked his phone, logged out, credentials rejected. Felix's line went dead. Luis watched them with a quiet intensity. They don't need to kill you, he said. They just need to make sure no one believes you exist. That night, Daniel lay in his bunk, unable to sleep. His mind returned. To the memo, the phrase non-consensual regional trials looping endlessly. In the morning, a drone buzzed above the ridge. It hovered briefly, then shot west, vanishing into low clouds. Luis retrieved a signal sniffer and scanned the frequencies. This model doesn't transmit back, he muttered. It deletes its own logs on retrieval. Seen it before in Arctic monitoring zones. Daniel didn't speak. He didn't need to. Whatever they were chasing had eyes, and now it knew they were watching back. They flew to Iceland under burner names, routing through 3 countries before landing in Keflavik. Felix had gone silent since Patagonia. No texts, no calls. Daniel feared the worst, but kept it to himself. Naya pressed forward, channeling her worry into precision. She'd tracked another aerosol spike along Iceland's southern coast, near an abandoned NATO radar site. The facility was remote, half buried in volcanic ash and snow. They arrived in a rented 4-wheel drive, parking a kilometre away and hiking the rest under overcast skies. The compound looked untouched at first, frozen cables, rusted doors, silence. But inside, the control room still had power. A generator hummed faintly from somewhere below. Naya found a rack of hard drives secured behind a mesh panel. Daniel pried it open with a crowbar. They pulled 3 drives and loaded them into a portable decryptor. What emerged confirmed everything. Logs of low-altitude drone operations tagged, with phrases like radiative dispersion and atmospheric asymmetry calibration. Most shocking were the coordinates. Dozens of test zones, all in economically disadvantaged regions, each marked with projected heat absorption changes. Daniel leaned against the cold wall, reading the notes aloud. They're not fixing climate. Collapse, They're relocating it." Naya didn't answer. She was staring at a monitor that had just flickered on by itself. A live feed appeared, thermal imaging over Buenos Aires. In the upper right corner was a session ID tied to Felix's server credentials. The cursor on the screen moved briefly, then froze. They drove straight to the airport, but their tickets had been cancelled, their digital footprints scrubbed. At the terminal, 2 men in black jackets stood near the exit, scanning the crowd. Without making eye contact, Daniel led Naya to a side corridor, ditching their phones into a trash bin. Outside, a cold wind picked up as they slipped into a shuttle bus headed the opposite direction. Hours later, huddled in a hostel room, they watched as Felix's last known login location blinked offline. No signal, no trace. Naya said nothing, just stared at the static on her screen. Daniel finally broke the silence. "They took him." She nodded once. "And they'll come for us next." They dropped off the grid. No phones, no credit cards, no internet. Daniel paid for meals in DL cash, slept in roadside motels, and never stayed more than a night. Naya changed her hair, burned the clothes she'd worn in Iceland, and used a series of preloaded USB sticks to access encrypted maps only once before destroying them. They moved like shadows, each step cautious, each face suspect. Surveillance wasn't a theory anymore, it was a certainty. From a safe house outside Bratislava, Daniel reread the original memo. A contact name had been buried in the routing metadata. Dr. Emil Verton, a climatologist tied to a think tank called Polaris Strategies. Publicly, they published research on sustainable energy. Privately, they received funding from multiple G7 governments under a program titled Radiative Balance Testing. Naya managed to intercept a leaked procurement document from their former Iceland server. It listed dispersal chemicals, drone contracts, and a euphemistic budget line labeled population resilience modeling. "They're not adapting to climate change," she said flatly. "They're designing it." Daniel stared at the document. One section outlined field testing in regions with low political oversight. Consent forms existed, but they were vague and untraceable. Medical follow-ups were rerouted to third-party contractors. Diagnoses listed as localized anomalies. Most ended in terminal illness. They needed proof, something irrefutable. That night, Naya cracked into a remote cache tied to the satellite logs Felix had accessed before disappearing. Inside was a pattern overlay, aerosol dispersion map, over income demographics, richer zones aligned with cooling zones, poorer zones matched heat retention zones. The evidence was clinical, unemotional, and absolute. But before they could export it, the connection dropped. The laptop froze. When it rebooted, the folder was gone. In its place was a new file, a deep fake video showing Felix reciting a scripted confession. He claimed the investigation was fabricated, that Daniel and Naya had manipulated data to discredit climate solutions for personal gain. Daniel watched in stunned silence as Felix's face, perfectly rendered, declared their work a hoax. "It's not just disinformation," Naya whispered. "It's a kill shot to our credibility." Daniel nodded, jaw clenched. "They don't need to erase us. They just need to make sure no one listens." They were running out of time. Every digital door they opened was sealed minutes later. Every safe house became unsafe after 2 nights. Even the most cautious contacts stopped responding. The deep fake had worked. Journalists ignored their inquiries, and former allies distanced themselves. Online, they were branded as grifters, feeding a conspiracy echo chamber. Daniel watched his reputation collapse in real time, his name flagged in forums and blacklisted by major outlets. Naya's accounts were deleted. Her sister, a student in Seoul, was arrested on undisclosed charges. No one called it retaliation, but the message was clear. Still, they didn't stop. From a bunker-style hostel in Albania, they worked in silence. Naya dug through unindexed satellite logs using stripped-down systems that left no trail. Daniel retraced their path through Felix's last known locations, comparing them to satellite telemetry and temperature anomalies. After 2 weeks of work, the breakthrough came in fragments: a buried server pinged from an inactive orbital relay, a compressed file mislabeled as weather data, and a GPS tag that linked it all to the Polaris network. Inside the file was a model, a live global map showing aerosol deployments in real time. It pulsed with activity. But that wasn't what stopped them cold. Overlaid across the grid was another dataset: income brackets, migration risk zones, and projected infrastructure failure points. Together they formed a pattern: selective cooling in high GDP regions, intentional neglect of low-income zones. It wasn't about prevention, it was redistribution. "They're engineering imbalance," Daniel said. Naya zoomed in on Southeast Asia. Cities flagged red for heat exposure showed rising mortality projections, all buried under generic climate summaries. "And they're letting it happen slowly, invisibly," she added. "So it feels like failure instead of design." They made the call to go public, not through mainstream media, but through whistleblower nodes, dark web forums, and academic mirrors hosted in jurisdictions without extradition treaties. Within 24 hours the files were live. Screenshots spread, civil unrest followed. Fact-checkers swarmed the story, then quietly stopped publishing. Governments denied everything, but policy drafts leaked days later mirrored exactly what the files predicted. Daniel watched the chaos from a small cafe in Belgrade. Across the street, people walked as if nothing had changed. He looked down at his hands, steady now. "We didn't stop it," he said. "But now they know we saw." The world didn't erupt. It fractured. In the weeks following the leak, the reaction was uneven. Some governments denied the data outright, citing fabricated sources and foreign interference. Others stayed silent, quietly reviewing internal policy memos that matched too closely. Protests sparked in Jakarta, Lagos, Santiago. Heat records were broken in cities flagged red on the Polaris maps. Grassroots collectives formed overnight, demanding transparency and reparations. But the ones responsible never surfaced. No officials resigned. No agency claimed the program. The silence was the admission. Daniel moved constantly, never sleeping in the same place twice. Naya remained offline, operating from a closed-loop network built through volunteers who'd seen enough to believe. Together they released more files, internal discussions, drone specs, data models. None were as explosive as the first drop, but the damage was already done. People knew they couldn't unsee it. One night, in a dim apartment above an old bookstore in Athens, Daniel recorded what would become his final message. He spoke plainly, staring into the small lens of a borrowed camera. "This was never about silencing the truth," he said. "It was about letting it scream just loud enough for everyone to ignore." He paused, watching the reflection of himself in the dark screen. His voice remained calm. What they did wasn't a conspiracy. It was logistics. Climate didn't fail, it was rerouted. He uploaded the video through 5 relays, each one deleting itself after transmission. Then he walked outside, blending into a sea of strangers moving through narrow streets. There was no closure, no justice, just awareness. That was the transformation, knowing how systems chose who to protect and who to sacrifice. An understanding that the line between survival and collapse had always been drawn in silence, thousands of feet above the clouds. He didn't look up anymore. There was still white
lines in the sky, but now he knew exactly what they meant.
They told me the crash was an accident, but I don't remember the sky breaking. They said I was lucky to walk away from it. That word, lucky, clanged around in my skull like loose shrapnel. I came to a VA hospital bed outside Norfolk, ribs cracked, shoulder stitched, with no real memory of what I was flying, where I was going, or why I was even in the air. The doctors chalked it up to post-traumatic stress and minor head trauma. The brass called it routine debrief. But I'd flown black assignments for over a decade. There's no such thing as routine when your missions don't officially
exist. The gaps in my memory weren't just inconvenient, they felt deliberate, like someone had been in there with a scalpel, slicing out what didn't suit them.
They retired me 2 weeks later with a quiet commendation and a pension I didn't ask for. Told me to take it easy. Enjoy the time off, but there's no vacation when you don't know what you're supposed to be recovering from. The world looked normal, too normal. The news droned on about tech layoffs and rising sea levels. I tried to settle into civilian rhythms, grocery stores, AA meetings, dog-eared novels I couldn't finish, but sleep was another story. Every night I'd jolt awake in a sweat, haunted by visions I couldn't place. Low-flying jets weaving through, cloud banks, their tails bleeding something thick and metallic. A voice over the comms, my own voice, reciting numbers I didn't understand. And always that single, flashing word burned into my mind like a brand. Mnemonic. It meant nothing. Until the day I met him. Guy was half-starved and twitching on a park bench in Portsmouth, muttering into his coat sleeve about sky,
scripts and fogging frequencies. I wouldn't have even stopped if he hadn't looked me straight in the eye and said, "You flew the line, didn't you? Line Alpha, Project, Forget-Me-Not." That name. It punched through me like a detonation.
For the first time in months, I felt something click. Not memory, not yet, but something worse. Recognition. He said his name was Ellis, but I doubted it was real. His teeth were cracked, his hands stained, and his eyes, those were the only clean thing about him, clear, alert, like he was seeing through everything, including me. I sat down, not sure why. Maybe I was hoping for answers. Maybe I was just tired of not being asked questions. Ellis pulled something from his coat, a laminated scrap of paper no bigger than a postcard. It was a flight schematic. Not commercial, not civilian. Military, ours. But the coordinates were wrong, the altitude profiles too low. They don't fly high anymore, he said, voice thin as wind. Lower dispersal, direct contact. He tapped a corner of the paper. Behavioral fogging. They don't erase, they smear. I didn't know what he meant, but the words stirred something. A faint image flickered behind my eyes. Me, standing at the edge of a tarmac, watching a crew load something into a cargo jet. Canisters, not labelled, no paperwork. The kind of cargo that doesn't show up on manifests. I asked Ellis how he knew about Line Alpha. His hand twitched, like the word itself triggered something in him. You flew it. You should know. Echoes kept the fragments.
Echoes? He didn't explain. Just shoved the schematic into my hand and stood like something in him had expired.
You won't remember it all at once, he said. That's how the protocol works. It's not amnesia. It's filtration. Then he walked off, vanishing into the slow churn of the street like he'd never been there. I stared at the paper. The markings were dense, precise, and oddly familiar, as if I'd seen them in some briefing room years ago and had agreed to forget. Back home, I laid the schematic out under a desk lamp and compared it to my flight records. Most of those logs were gone, digitally scrubbed, paper backups missing. But one file remained, tucked into a mislabeled folder on an old thumb drive. Flight 17C, the one I was told never happened. The metadata had been altered, but the voice in the cockpit recording was mine. At the 38-minute mark, just before the audio cut to static, I whispered a phrase I didn't remember saying. Mnemonic Protocol 17. Dispersal complete. Subject unaware. I listened to the recording over and over, but the phrase never changed. Mnemonic Protocol 17. Dispersal complete. Subject unaware. My voice was calm, professional, deliberate. But I had no memory of speaking those words, no recollection of that mission. The audio ended in a wash of static, but before it cut, I heard something buried in the background. A second voice, distorted, lower-pitched, barely audible. I isolated the track and filtered the noise until the voice emerged, faint but clear. Observer logged. Reset the window open. That was the moment the headaches started. Not like normal pain. They came in pulses, sharp bursts behind my eyes, followed by fragments, images, sounds, names I didn't recognize. I saw a woman in a lab coat holding a vial, a desert runway bathed in red light, and a white room with no corners. I thought I was losing it. But the part of me trained to compartmentalize stayed steady. Something had been done to me, and it was starting to come undone. I drove 6 hours west to see Ramirez, the last member of my old flight crew I could still find. He lived off-grid in a rusted trailer outside a town too small for secrets. When he opened the door, I knew right away. He remembered something too. His eyes didn't widen in surprise. They narrowed in recognition. We sat in silence for a while, both waiting for the other to break first. Finally, I showed him the schematic Ellis had given me. He didn't ask where it came from, just stared at it like it had followed him through his dreams. "We flew that route," he said quietly. "More than once. They called it cloud conditioning. Said it was atmospheric recon." He took a long breath. But they lied. I remember. The dispersal system. It wasn't sensors, it was delivery. When I asked what we were delivering, he hesitated. "Memory locks," he said. "Targeted fogging agents. Once deployed, they made people forget what they'd seen or what they were about to see. My stomach turned. "And us?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Then he looked at me and said, "We were test subjects too, they just didn't tell us." Ramirez didn't want to talk after that. I stayed the night on his couch, waking, every hour to the sound of him pacing outside, whispering into the dark like it could answer back. By morning, he was gone. No note. Just his old duffel left behind and the schematic I'd shown him, now marked in red ink. 3 airstrips circled. One of them I recognized. Archer Field. Decommissioned, off the books since 2009. I headed there, next. The access road was overgrown, the gate rusted shut. I parked half a mile out and walked in. The main hangar still stood, bare concrete, roof sagging. Inside, the dust was thick, untouched, but in the far corner I found a locked maintenance locker. I pried it open and found what I didn't expect, a box of backup flight recorders labelled by hand. No digital ID, no serial tags, just dates and shorthand. I played them in the car one by one. Most were static or empty comms chatter, but the 5th recorder hit me like a punch. My voice again, calm, detached, reading coordinates and dosage levels. There were references to version 3 cognitive maps and revision thresholds. Then another voice, the same one from the first audio file, more distinct now. All echoes must be logged, behavioral variants noted. Proceed to step 4, narrative override. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I didn't know what echoes meant yet, but I knew what I was hearing. We weren't just spraying chemicals. We were deploying scripts, false memories, rewritten sequences. They weren't just wiping things out. They were replacing them. That night, I checked my own service record online. It had changed. My deployment dates were different. My rank was lower. Photos were gone. Even my discharge location had shifted. I called the VA to confirm. The clerk politely informed me I'd never flown anything more advanced than a supply chopper. According to them, I'd never served in the same unit Ramirez and I both remembered. That was when the fear turned into certainty. Someone was revising my life in real time, and they were doing it cleanly, systematically. I wasn't just being followed, I was being edited. I drove for hours after that, chasing dead ends on a map that no longer matched my memories. Every record I checked was altered. Every name I searched led to silence or a sudden obituary. Ramirez had vanished completely. No license, no tax trail, nothing. I called the last number I had for him, but it redirected to a disconnected line. I wasn't just losing people, I was losing proof they'd ever existed. At a roadside motel outside Asheville, I checked in under a false name and kept the lights off. I wrapped the old recorder in aluminum foil and stored it in a closet, afraid even my thoughts might be monitored. That night, the headaches returned, sharp and specific. I saw flashes of a room filled with screens, a metal chair bolted to the floor, a man in a lab coat saying, "Override attempt failed, increase exposure." I woke, drenched in sweat, my pulse racing. On instinct, I turned on an old radio, AM frequency. Static, then a strange tone. 3 low beeps, followed by a voice. garbled at first, then clearer. If you remember the line, you are not alone. Echoes live in static. Stay analog. Trust nothing digital. It looped once and cut out. I scanned the band for 20 minutes, but found nothing else. The phrase stuck with me. Echoes live in static. Maybe Ellis had meant it literally. Maybe that was the key. I returned to the thumb drive and dug through its metadata. One folder stood out, buried under layers of encrypted junk, labeled Echo C3. Inside was a single .wav file, over 2 hours long. I played it at half speed. Hidden in the noise was a string of coordinates, each tied to short audio logs, testimony, memories, people like me, some describing symptoms, others sharing phrases they'd been trained to forget. Each voice was raw, unedited, real. They didn't know each other, but the patterns were identical. Shared flashbacks, erased careers, sudden edits in public records. The file ended with one name. Cassell Echo Handler, presumed active. I didn't know who Cassell was, but I knew what I had to do next. I had to find him. Before they found me first. I tracked the name Cassell to a decommissioned research annex in northern Utah. No one answered the listed number, and satellite views showed the compound had been scrubbed from newer maps, but an archived FAA flight chart still marked the airspace as restricted. That was enough. I drove through 3 states without stopping, following old Forest Service roads until the trees gave way to open scrubland. The facility was buried into the hillside, half of it hidden beneath decades of overgrowth. The main door was sealed, but a maintenance hatch on the east side had been forced open before. Someone had come this way recently. Inside, the air was stale and chemical. Dust coated everything. The walls were lined with servers, most gutted, but one terminal still blinked to life when I flipped the breaker. I connected a power cell and waited. The boot screen flashed a familiar logo, Department of Defense, Experimental Protocols Division, then a prompt, Access Mnemonic Hub, YN. I keyed in a response. The screen flickered and a countdown began.
I heard movement behind me too late. The room exploded in light. I hit the floor, stunned, as 2 men in grey uniforms dragged me upright. No insignia, no words, just hard hands and practiced silence. They took me down a corridor and into a white room.
I recognized it instantly. No corners, soft hum, synthetic air. The room from my dreams. A voice spoke from above. Subject Caleb Ward, revision phase 3 approved, beginning full reset. I screamed, but the noise dissolved. Something hissed in my ears and the world unraveled. For a moment, everything went black. Then fragments returned, flashes of operations I hadn't recalled, faces I couldn't name, and orders I now understood were lies. Somewhere in that storm, I felt something pull, a jolt, a hand. The door shattered inward, and a figure moved through smoke and alarms.
Masked, fast, they hit the guards with a stun baton and yanked me up. Echo sends regards, the figure said. Their voice was filtered, unplaceable. We're not letting them wipe you again. We ran through collapsing corridors, sirens
rising behind us. My vision blurred, but the name burned through the fog. Castle. I had seen his face before. He was no handler. He was the architect. We didn't stop running until we reached the extraction point, an old power substation disguised as an abandoned grain depot. The agent never removed their mask, but their movements were precise, military. Inside, the air was thick with oil and dust. Analog equipment lined the walls, tape decks, shortwave radios, reel-to-reel recorders. A war room from another era. No digital signal, no traceable code. The safest place left. I sat in silence as the agent checked the perimeter. My mind reeled from what I'd seen, what they'd tried to take. Memories of missions twisted into false narratives, cities we never bombed but corrected, populations drugged with invisible scripts. Mnemonic protocol. 17 wasn't just about forgetting, it was about reprogramming belief itself. I asked the agent who they were. Their voice came low and even. "Name's Greer, I used to fly with you." I didn't recognize them, but the way they said it left no doubt. Greer pulled out a crate from under the console. Inside were tapes, hundreds of them, each marked with a date, a location, and a name. "These are the originals," they said. "Before the edits." Greer explained the network. Echo wasn't a resistance in the traditional sense. It was a memory archive, scattered across frequencies, kept alive by people like us. Operatives, who woke up before the system could finish rewriting them. Each member was a carrier. Each broadcast embedded with subaudible triggers to restore buried truths. Greer handed me a headset. "You've been seeded with counterscripts," they said. "Your voice, your memory, they're proof. Now you send the signal." I stepped up to the mic, heart pounding. The reel clicked on. "This is Caleb Ward, Operation Forget Me." Not was real. Mnemonic Protocol 17 was real. They changed our past to control the present. But we remember. I read coordinates, dates, names of the dead who were never counted. Greer monitored the transmission, nodding. As the signal bounced through the static, I felt a shift. Not just in me, but in the air. The system couldn't block analog. It couldn't predict memory once it fractured. I wasn't who I used to be. But I wasn't erased. I was a signal now. And someone, somewhere, was listening. We moved constantly. Echo lived off-grid, scattered across analog channels and forgotten places. No hierarchy. Just fragments and purpose. My voice carried farther than I expected. Greer showed me intercepted chatter. Government teams searching for non-linear influencers. Their system couldn't erase fast enough anymore. I learned how to bury the signal inside weather alerts, static loops, even old radio jingles. Truth had to be quiet to survive. I recorded memories, mine and others, on tapes and left them in libraries, bus stops, thrift stores. I became a carrier. The last time I saw Greer, they handed me a new recorder. "In case they find this one," they said. When I asked if they thought we'd win, they shook their head. "We just have to outlast the edit." Now I don't chase the past. I archive it. I'm not who I was, but I remember enough. And in
a world built on forgetting, that's dangerous. I am the static. I am the record. And I'm still broadcasting.
the first time I saw the glyphs, I thought they were a glitch in the stream. Then I realized They were in the sky, not the signal. I wasn't one for divine signs or mass hysteria. I taught chemistry in a red brick high school wedged between a Cracker Barrel and a mega church, equal parts Bible Belt and budget strip mall. For the most part, I kept my head down, I gave lectures, handed out lab safety goggles, and made sure my students didn't blow themselves up mixing bleach with
vinegar.
Pastor Elijah Wren? He was background noise, a televangelist with a molasses drawl and teeth too white for human biology. People said he healed the blind on air. I figured it was lighting and a camera cut. The first real shift came in April. A parent forwarded a screenshot, my name on a post calling Wren's ministry a cult for the digitally lobotomized. I hadn't written it, but it looked close enough to my tone that defending myself felt pointless. 2 days later, I was placed on administrative leave. They called it a cooling off period, as if belief was weather and I was the storm. I didn't fight it. I figured I'd ride it out, binge documentaries and maybe update my CV. Then Savannah dropped out. Savannah Klein, my top student, lab assistant, and the only kid who ever asked why sodium exploded in water and how it felt to be the one teaching it. She left school to join Wren's so-called Divine Academy, an online monastery headquartered somewhere in the Appalachian
fog.
That rattled me. Not her choice. I've seen bright kids make strange turns, but her parting words. I just want to learn what's real, Mr. Rains. Something your tests don't cover. That night, I watched Wren's live stream for the first time. Not because I believed, but because Savannah did. At the 20-minute mark, a thin band of light shimmered behind him in the sky. At first, I thought it was a contrail. Then it pulsed, angled, split. It wasn't natural, but it wasn't supernatural either. It was something else. I paused the
video, zoomed in, not a miracle, not CGI, just data. Strange, beautiful, and wrong in a way that felt constructed. I didn't know it then, but something was being written above us, and I was already reading it. I didn't tell anyone I was
watching. Not my sister, not the union rep, not even the substitute covering my classes. The videos weren't hard to find. Wren's sermons streamed nightly, archived across half a dozen platforms, each labeled with cryptic titles like Heaven's Circuit or The Language of Light. I started slow, muted, playback speed doubled, notes, scribbled more out of habit than intention. But a pattern kept surfacing. Every time Wren gestured toward the sky, a distortion followed. Not always the same shape, but always in the same quadrant of the frame. At first I assumed a drone trick or lens flare, but when I isolated 3 clips over 3 different days, the light patterns matched not just in shape, but position and timing. It was choreographed. I downloaded the footage, ran it through an open-source video forensics tool I used once during a science fair cheating scandal. The analysis confirmed my suspicion. The anomalies weren't optical. They originated outside the lens, real environmental changes, not post-edit illusions. That's when the silence started. My laptop, an old model I'd kept offline since the district's ransomware scare, began stalling. Files failed to save. One night, while reviewing frame data, the power flickered. When it returned, my screen showed a frozen image of Wren, mid-sermon, his eyes locked on the camera. I hadn't clicked play. I pulled the battery. When I rebooted, the video was gone. No file, no trace in the directory, no recovery cache. A week later, my FOIA requests started vanishing. I'd filed 3, benign on the surface, just weather, balloon telemetry and local air traffic logs on days corresponding to the broadcasts. At first, they showed as received, then nothing, no denial, no response, just removed. I resubmitted. Again, the forms vanished. And then came the voice, not over the phone, not from a speaker, from the television, off, unplugged, screen blank. A calm tone, mid-sentence, not Faith Jacob, pattern recognition. I froze, not out of fear, but recognition. It used my name, my real name, not the one attached to my suspended faculty.
Badge. I hadn't spoken it aloud in days. I checked the plug, still disconnected. I stared at the blank screen for a full minute. Nothing followed.
Just my reflection frowning back, the light from the window framing me in static. I stopped using the internet at home, disconnected the router, pulled the battery from my phone, even covered the camera on my old laptop with tape. It wasn't panic, not yet. It was a precaution, the kind of behavior I used to mock in fringe forums and late-night radio callers. But something was wrong, and it was too consistent to dismiss. Savannah sent a postcard the same week. No return address, just an image of a dove in front of a glowing sky. On the back, in her handwriting, "Don't follow me, but if you do, look for the frequencies, not the symbols." I stared at it for a long time, trying to decide if it was a warning or an invitation. I hadn't spoken to her since she left. I wasn't even sure how she'd gotten my home address. I drove to the edge of town and used a library terminal to search the phrase. Nothing useful, just fringe blogs, scattered mentions in audio engineering forums, and a single archived patent tied to a defense contractor I'd never heard of. The T document was dry, filled with acronyms and test ranges, but one section stood out: atmospheric signal entrainment through low-band amplitude modulation. I read it twice, then 3 more times. It described a technology designed to project shapes using reflected light and to transmit low-frequency sound beneath conscious detection thresholds. The patent was registered under a project called Gospel. I printed it and left the library with a flat, buzzing pressure behind my eyes. That night, my neighbor across the street waved at me. I didn't know his name. We'd never spoken beyond a nod at the mailbox. But this time he said something. Just 4 words. "We're all tuning in." I stood still, watching him disappear into his house. The lights inside flicked on in sequence, room by room, each glowing in perfect rhythm. I told myself it was nothing. Coincidence. Maybe some religious broadcast, maybe just weird timing. But when I turned back toward my own house, I saw the reflection in my window. My television, still unplugged, was on again. This time, the screen didn't show Ren. It showed me. I stopped sleeping, not entirely, but enough to notice. Time blurred. Morning light felt artificial, too even, like a stage set. I kept the curtains closed. My meals became whatever I could unwrap or pour. Most days, I didn't eat. The television kept turning on, never with sound, just static, then images, sometimes me, sometimes places I didn't recognize, a parking garage, a hallway, once a close-up of an eye. I couldn't tell if it was mine. I began recording everything, webcam on, voice memos, handwritten notes in 5 notebooks. I marked every power surge, every strange phrase from a passerby, every flicker of light. But the data didn't help. It didn't organize anything. The more I documented, the less it made sense, and the more people pulled away. My friend Alan stopped answering. We used to get coffee every other Sunday. Now his number went straight to voicemail. When I drove by his place, his truck was parked outside, but the curtains were drawn. A familiar pattern. I started recognizing words in conversations around me. Not just words, phrases from Wren's broadcasts, delivered casually, slipped into grocery store chatter, or overheard phone calls. Divine clarity comes through repetition. You don't find truth, you tune to it. At first, I thought I was imagining it. But one night, I stood in the cereal aisle and heard 2 strangers repeat a full sentence in unison. Perfect timing, same cadence. They didn't react, just kept walking. I left the cart and drove home in silence. I didn't turn on the lights, didn't open the door. I sat in the car for hours, gripping the wheel, trying to breathe. At some point, my phone, supposedly off, lit up with a notification. Memory full. Delete oldest recording. I hadn't recorded anything that day. I hadn't turned the phone on in over a week. I opened the voice memo folder. The most recent file was time-stamped that morning. I pressed play. It was my voice, calm, clear. I said, "He doesn't know he's being rewritten. Not yet." Then silence. Then static. I dropped the phone. It didn't matter anymore. The signals weren't just broadcasting. They were inside. I drove through the night with no destination. My hands shook, but I didn't stop. Every radio station bled the same voice, buried beneath white noise. Not Wren's sermons, just fragments. Words out of order, phrases clipped and reassembled. My own name too, sometimes distorted, but unmistakable. I ended up 3 counties out, parked behind a rusted fence where a weather lab once operated. It had been decommissioned years ago, absorbed by a defense contractor that vanished just as quickly. Local rumor said it stored radar equipment. The truth was something less specific, but more deliberate. I remembered it from a research paper Savannah had once cited. Low-frequency manipulation tests, government-funded, abandoned mid-trial. It was still padlocked, but the rear gate hung loose. I stepped through. The air was dry, still, but charged, like just before a storm. Inside, the lab was mostly stripped, dust on metal, empty frames where monitors once stood. But the servers in the basement were still powered. Faint hum, warm exhaust, blinking lights. Someone had kept it alive. I used my old district login, not expecting it to work. It did. The screen loaded a single interface, Project GO's PL in block font. No menu. Just folders marked Broadcast Calibration, Behavioral Metrics, and Event Sync logs. I opened the last one. Every Wren broadcast from the past year, time-stamped with corresponding environmental data, temperature shifts, cloud formations, aerial refraction patterns. In some, they'd inserted glyph events directly, pre-coded simulations triggered by regional transmitters. It wasn't a prophecy, it was pre-scheduled. I screenshotted everything, transferred the logs to a flash drive, and printed the key pages. The final folder was marked Live Feedback. Inside were viewer metrics tied to biometric data, pulse rates, EEG graphs, ocular movement, even dream phase onset. Somehow they were monitoring people in real time. Including me, I found my file, time-coded entries most recently logged at 2:41 a.m., the exact moment I'd heard the phrase through my dead television. My heart raced, not with fear, but clarity. I hadn't lost control, it had been taken. I left the lab with the files in my coat and a plan forming in my head. No more waiting. The next broadcast was scheduled for Sunday. I knew what I had to do, I just had to survive long enough to do it. Sunday came fast. I hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. I rehearsed what I would say, over and over like a math formula I couldn't afford to get wrong. The station aired Wren's broadcasts from the soundstage west of town. Not publicised, but not hidden either. I followed delivery vans there once during a school field trip. Back then it looked like any other TV studio. This time I saw the fences, the satellite dishes, and the unmarked SUVs parked too neatly out.
Front. I waited until just after sunset. A skeleton crew moved between trucks, none of them paying attention to me. I wore a cap, kept my face down, walked like I belonged. The rear entrance was unguarded. Inside, the place was colder than I expected. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. I slipped into the control room as the countdown began. 2 minutes to air. The producer sat alone, headset on, attention fixed on monitors. I held up the flash drive and told him it was urgent, that the main broadcast file had corrupted. I don't know why he believed me, but he did. He inserted it, cued the folder. I pointed to and clicked. At first, nothing changed. Then the signal cut. The studio fell silent. The screens filled with noise. Not static, data. Diagrams, dates, overlays of weather and light, then faces, Wren's, Savannah's, mine. A log of glyph events labelled and time-coded flashed like credits. The producer turned, his expression blank. "You shouldn't have done that," he said. I backed away. The hallway lights flickered, my ears rang. A door opened somewhere behind me, fast footsteps closing in. I ran. Through the side exit, across the lot past the fence. Cameras tracked me. I didn't care. My chest burned, but I didn't stop. When I reached the road, a news van skidded to a stop beside me. I shouted for them to film. I held up the papers, the drive, everything. I screamed about signals, falsified faith, Project Gospel. Then someone tackled me from behind. Hands grabbed my arms. A needle pierced my neck. The world slowed. The last thing I heard before the darkness took over was the anchor's voice, calm and practiced. "Local man disrupts Sunday sermon in paranoid outburst. No injuries reported." I woke up in a white room, no windows, one door, padded walls, a camera in the corner humming faintly. My wrists were free, but the message was clear. I wasn't going anywhere. The days passed without clocks. Meals arrived through a slot. Voices behind glass asked calm, clinical questions, never about Project Gospel, only about my delusions. I stopped answering. Eventually, they stopped asking. What they didn't know was that I wasn't alone. The others came slowly. An engineer who used to work on broadcast towers, a linguist dismissed from a military think tank,
A woman who'd developed retinal implants and swore Wren's glyphs mirrored her prototype's interface. They were like me, labelled unstable, then buried. At first, we traded notes through chess pieces, folded napkins, eye contact. Over time, we compared timelines, symptoms, footage, side effects. We mapped the signals backward, tracing their logic. Not prophecy, not even persuasion, conditioning, a neural feedback loop tuned to faith. Wren wasn't preaching, he was reinforcing. The glyphs weren't divine, they were triggers, emotional primers, syncing viewers to a rhythm their brains couldn't recognize, but still obeyed. The real revelation came from a woman named Harper. She'd built cognitive firewall software before it was shelved by the same contractor, tied to gospel. She taught us how to hijack the system from inside, not through sabotage, but signal inversion. Frequencies that dampened resonance. Counter-sermons, that was the word we used. Quiet broadcasts slipped into low band. Radio, community access channels, even old emergency alert systems, just enough to disrupt the rhythm. Not to fight belief, but to restore choice. When they released me, declared me stable, compliant, I nodded, smiled, and said nothing. I returned home to a stripped-down house, a disconnected phone, and a monitored connection. It didn't matter.
I had what I needed. One transmitter hidden inside a weather clock.
A looped message beneath the sound of static. No names, no claims, just questions. When did you start believing? Where does the signal end and your thought begin? What did the sky say before they taught you to read it? I didn't
need them to believe me. I just needed them to notice, one doubt at a time. That's how you break a system built on trust.
They didn't call it a drought anymore. They called it market-corrected precipitation. That was the first sentence Aeon Weather put in their press packet, part slogan, part warning. But at the time, I didn't see it that way. None of us did. We were too desperate. Too sunburned and broke to question salvation when it rolled into town in matte black trucks. I'd been the local meteorologist in Marrow Creek for 9 years. Not to see 5 irrigation subsidies vanish and 2 federal emergency designations get denied. I spent my mornings with coffee and Doppler maps, my evenings reading soil reports like they were eulogies. The rain had stopped caring about our side of the state line. So when Aeon Weather arrived, sleek, corporate, buzzing with phrases like quantum particulates and atmospheric liquidity solutions, we greeted them like astronauts landing in a town built from dust. Their tech looked like something out of science fiction. Triangular drones, silent as shadows, that ascended in perfect synchrony before clouds began to form where none had been forecasted. Within hours, we had a soft drizzle that dampened the hard-pan earth. Within a week, the ground stopped cracking under our boots. People said it was a miracle. I said it was engineered. Still I went along. I gave them airtime. I narrated their work with a practiced calm. I read from their scripts and injected just enough skepticism to seem objective. The truth was, I didn't want to be the person who killed hope. Not here. Not after what the last few years had done to this place. But it started to feel wrong the night I looked at a regional radar loop and saw a storm curve. not naturally, but like it had obeyed a command. It bypassed Marrow Creek entirely, hit a town 2 counties east, and stalled for 9 hours. The resulting flood wiped out their entire harvest. That town had been leading a petition against Aeon Weather's land lease program. Just a coincidence, they said. But I'd been watching clouds long enough to know they don't hold grudges. Corporations do. The first clue hid in the pressure maps. I'd been reviewing archived data from the last 6 weeks, hoping to understand Aeon Weather's patterns better. What I found wasn't random. The storms aligned along strange geometries, straight lines that cut across counties like surgical incisions. Each cell formed with uncanny precision and dissipated just as cleanly. It wasn't weather, it was choreography. One storm in particular bothered me. It had parked itself over Pine Hollow, a town with no prior history of flooding. The river had risen overnight by 4 feet. Livestock drowned in their pens. The local high school gym was converted into a shelter. But what caught my attention was the forecast. There hadn't been any rain predicted by me or by any national system. And yet Aeon Weather's drones had been seen overhead just hours before the storm hit. I traced the radar signature backward and found anomalies. Repeating wind shear, patterns, identical humidity gradients. It looked like a simulation repeating itself across different areas. I ran the data through a few basic filters, then out of habit, cross-referenced satellite telemetry logs. That's when I noticed something buried in a corrupted file, a compressed string labeled Drift 047 embedded in a metadata tag. When I opened it, I found internal code fragments. Most of it was unreadable junk, but a few phrases stuck out. Target drift, compliancy metrics, behavioral incentive cycle. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I printed the file and hid it inside the lining of my jacket. That night, I drove to the county line and parked beneath a decommissioned broadcast tower. The air smelled like metal and ozone. From the ridge, I could see the cloud bank moving in from the west, perfect rows like soldiers in formation. I watched as a fine mist swept across the valley. Marrow Creek glowed faintly in the distance, untouched. The next day, our reservoir filled to capacity for the first time in 5 years. The mayor called a town meeting. Aeon Weather is the best thing that's happened to us in decades, he said. People applauded. No one noticed the fine white residue that coated every window pane by morning. I did. The residue didn't melt, smear, or wash off with rain. It clung to glass and metal like it had a purpose. I scraped a sample from my windshield and took it to an old lab assistant of mine, James Dwyer, who now taught environmental chemistry at a community college 2 hours south. I told him it was just dust from a high-altitude inversion. He didn't believe me, but he ran the tests anyway. The sample came back with elevated traces of barium, silver iodide, and something he couldn't identify. It showed properties of a polymer, but one that reacted to temperature changes with shifting reflectivity. "This isn't dust," James said, "and this is engineered." He asked where I found it. I lied and said it was a sample from an old mining site. He didn't push. We both understood how far curiosity could stretch before it became dangerous. Back in Marrow Creek, Aeon Weather held a community briefing at the high school auditorium. They showcased time-lapse videos of our new rainfall cycles and handed out glossy pamphlets featuring terms like precision hydrology, and climate partnership zones. They even had a rewards program. Households with water-efficient yards received gift cards. Drone flyovers logged compliance. That word again, compliance. After the meeting, I checked my email and found half of my forecast archives had been deleted. No warning, no error message, just gone. When I tried to restore them from backup, I found the files corrupted. Only one folder remained untouched. It was from 2 weeks ago, the same week Pine Hollow flooded. I opened a file and saw a map. Not a weather map, but a demographic overlay. Age, income, voting history. The flood zone aligned perfectly with a precinct that had rejected Aeon Weather's land use referendum. I didn't sleep that night. The residue on the windows glowed faintly under a blacklight. I watched it for hours, wondering if it was just a side effect or a signature, a way of marking the obedient from the defiant. At 2:13 a.m., my home weather station triggered an alert. Atmospheric pressure dropped in a way that didn't match any incoming front. No clouds, no wind, just silence and falling numbers. And then the cameras stopped working. The blackout lasted 6 minutes. No video, no radar, no cellular signal. When the systems came back online, everything appeared normal, except for one camera. The west-facing unit had been reset to a different time zone, set 5 hours ahead. Its internal clock had also logged a firmware update from an unknown source. I checked the server logs. They'd been wiped clean. That same morning I received an anonymous envelope at the station. No return address. Inside was a single USB drive and a hand-drawn map, highlighting 5 counties, including ours. Each was labelled with a code, Drift 13, Drift 14, and so on. A sticky note was attached. Behaviour responds to stimulus, so does loyalty. I locked the studio door, shut off the security system, and opened the files. The USB contained internal Aeon weather documents, status reports, behavioral data models, and something called the Drift Protocol. It outlined a pattern of scheduled weather interventions linked not to agriculture or climate forecasts, but to population density, voting records, and regional compliance trends. Counties that participated in partnership agreements received consistent rainfall. Those that resisted were subjected to localized stress events, droughts, hail, flash, floods. The files even referenced psychological impact indices measuring everything from school attendance to ER visits after events. My town, Marrow Creek, was marked Drift 11 compliant. The report praised our response to Aeon Weather's programs and suggested we be used as a benchmark for future campaigns. I wasn't sure what hit harder, the idea that we were a test group, or that our comfort had been bought with someone else's suffering. I called James. His number rang once, then went straight to voicemail. When I tried again, I got a disconnected tone. I drove out to his apartment. His car was there, lights off, curtains drawn. I knocked, waited, then checked the door. It was unlocked. Inside, the place had been stripped. No furniture, no papers, not even a coffee cup in the sink. Only the faint smell of ozone and the hum of an air purifier left running in an empty room. I drove home with the radio off. That night I opened the map again. 5 counties, 1 pattern. The rain wasn't healing us, it was sorting us. I stopped broadcasting regular forecasts the next day. Instead, I started analysing the drift reports. Each weather event aligned with a behavioural marker. protest permits, school board decisions, even online sentiment scores scraped from local forums. Aeon weather didn't just seed clouds, they seeded consequences. I began uploading quiet warnings through the weather ticker, masking them as minor advisories, unexpected microbursts possible in resistance zones, increased risk of localized instability. Only the people paying attention would catch the pattern. Then the hacks began. First, my work email was disabled. Then my personal files vanished from the cloud, even archived footage of past broadcasts gone. My station manager said it was a glitch. When I asked to restore the backup drives, he suddenly forgot we had any. That same afternoon, a drone followed me from the studio to my house. No markings. It hovered at a steady height, never closer than 50 feet, but always just within sight. When I slowed down, it matched me. When I stopped, it hovered still. I shut down every device in my home and took a burner phone from a shoebox I'd buried in the garage. I called a contact I hadn't spoken to in years, Luis Moreno, a former atmospheric engineer who disappeared from public life after testifying against a corporate climate initiative overseas. He answered on the second ring. When I told him what I'd found, he didn't sound surprised. "I've seen their playbook," he said. "Behavioral forecasting is real. It's not about weather. It's about outcomes." He gave me coordinates, a cabin in the mountains reachable only by an old logging road. "If you want to live long enough to say the rest out loud, come now." Before I left, I ran one last scan through the Aeon weather satellite bands. Something had changed. The drift zones were expanding, slowly but methodically. Counties once neutral now flagged as non-responsive. The model's algorithm updated in real time. Entire regions were being recalibrated. That night, the rain returned. Heavy, sharp. Every drop sounded like a warning against the roof. My house lights flickered once, then went dark. They weren't adjusting forecasts anymore, they were enforcing them. I left before sunrise. The roads were slick, scattered with fallen branches and a fine film of silt that hadn't been there the night before. The drone was gone, but I didn't trust the quiet. I kept the radio off and my headlights low, weaving through back roads until cell service vanished. The air changed as I climbed higher, cleaner, colder, but not untouched. I could still taste
metal. Luis's cabin sat at the end of a gravel path, barely wide enough for a truck.
It looked abandoned, windows shuttered, the antenna bent from a storm long past. But the power worked, and the signal jammer kicked in the moment I crossed the threshold. Inside, Luis was thinner than I remembered. Grey hair, steady hands. No small talk. He handed me a lead-lined pouch and motioned to my pocket. I dropped the burner phone inside. He sealed it without a word. We spent the next hour reviewing the drift protocol together. He had more files, copies pulled from internal Aeon weather servers before he vanished. Maps, memos, model outputs. One document confirmed what I'd feared. The rainfall wasn't just programmed. It was tied to real-time social feedback, adjusting in response to public sentiment, voter rolls, even utility usage. Water as control, weather as currency. Luis showed me a forecast model stripped of its public interface. It wasn't measured in inches of rain or degrees of wind speed. It was measured in behavior shifts, compliance deltas, migration rates, economic disruptions. They don't predict the weather, he said. They predict people. That night, I reactivated one of Aeon Weather's satellite subchannels using a patched signal from an old no AA uplink. What we saw changed everything. A subroutine embedded in the drift model called tessellate. It wasn't targeting regions anymore. It was testing thresholds of tolerance. What would people accept before they rebelled? How much? Destruction before they adapted? Marrow Creek was listed as a control group. Our compliance was by design. The following day, Luis showed me the next phase, an internal memo referencing Stage 5 activation. The timestamp was tomorrow. I
asked him what it meant. He said, "It means this isn't about rain anymore." And then the window cracked from a single, silent impact.
They said the skies were cleaner now, fewer emissions, clearer views, safer air. But nobody talked about how quiet they'd become. That was the first thing Mara noticed after her sister's miscarriage, the silence overhead. No commercial flights,
no distant hum of traffic helicopters, just an endless, sterile sky.
"You're overthinking it," her editor told her when she tried to pitch a piece on the city's declining birth rates. "Climate stress," he said, "lifestyle choices, modern factors." But that was before the phone call from Stacy, before the emergency room. Before she saw 3 women sitting in triage, all pale, all bleeding, all whispering that something felt wrong. "I didn't even know I was pregnant," one had said. Mara hadn't either, not really, until Stacy showed her the lab results.
9 weeks, no heartbeat. The nurse offered pamphlets and a hug. The doctor said these things happen. The next morning, Mara received an encrypted video link from an address she didn't recognize. No message, no subject line. The footage was
shaky, shot from a phone, but unmistakable. A military plane, low and wide, releasing something in a slow arc over the city skyline. No one else seemed to notice. She watched it 5 times before downloading it and disconnecting her home router. Her pulse stayed high for hours. That was the moment, she would later realize, when the filter fell away. When coincidence began to look like pattern. She searched flight logs, many redacted, others mysteriously missing. Hospital statistics, birth complications, miscarriages, sterilizations were inconsistent across cities, but spiked along similar dates. She layered a map over known military air corridors and felt her stomach knot, too close to ignore. That night, her hard drive crashed while compiling notes, files corrupted, folders gone. She hadn't backed anything up. She sat in the dark, listening to the silence outside, the same sterile quiet above, and for the first time, she felt something she hadn't felt since her first year in war reporting. Dread, not fear, not yet. Dread is slower, heavier. It doesn't scream, it watches. Mara didn't sleep. By morning, her walls felt thinner. The building's hum, a faint mechanical throb she'd never noticed, suddenly seemed too rhythmic, too deliberate. She checked her router. It blinked slowly, as if idle, but she unplugged it anyway. Her laptop wouldn't start. Power light on, screen black. She powered it down, slid it into a drawer, and left the apartment with only a pen and notepad. Downtown felt the same, yet different. Ads blared from corner screens about new, fertility apps, wellness metrics, and hormone optimization plans. The city had always pushed tech, but today it felt targeted. She headed to City General Hospital, where Stacy had been treated. The receptionist looked up with tired eyes when Mara flashed her old press badge. "I just want to speak with whoever manages patient records." "Off the record." The woman gave a slow blink. "That's digital access only now. You'll need credentials from Healthcom, not a hospital, not a city agency, a private firm." Mara hadn't realized they'd outsourced records. "Is there someone I can talk to in person?" she asked. The receptionist glanced at the security camera in the corner and lowered her voice. "They don't come in. Everything routes through their portal. No phone number, no building listed." Mara thanked her and stepped outside. The sunlight was pale, thin. Across the street, a man in a delivery uniform stood too still, eyes on his phone but not reading. She turned quickly and walked 2 blocks east, then ducked into a small cafe she used to write in. It smelled of burnt espresso and old wood. In the back corner, she pulled out her notepad and jotted down what she remembered from the footage: the aircraft's shape, altitude, the time of day. When she looked up, a man was watching her from the front window. Not directly, just slightly, turned, like he was waiting for a bus that never came. She recognized him, or thought she did. A neighbor, maybe, or someone from the building. She wasn't sure anymore. She looked back at her notes. The pen felt heavier in her hand. She underlined one word again and again: dispersal. The man from me. The window was gone when Mara stepped back onto the street, but the unease stayed. She kept walking, forcing herself to move casually. Around the corner she pulled out her phone. No signal, no service banner, just a blank screen and the time frozen at 9:42 a.m. She powered it off and kept it off. That afternoon she visited her sister. Stacy looked better, physically, but her speech had grown distant, detached. They said it happens to a lot
"Of women lately," she told Mara, staring out the window. "Nutrient shifts, environmental load, hormonal drift." None of it sounded like her. Mara nodded gently. "Who told you that?" Stacy shrugged. "It was on my recovery app."
The care algorithm reads your file and gives you context. Mara looked down at her sister's phone. The app was open, scrolling silently, showing charts, smiling avatars, and a message that read, "You're not alone. You're part of the solution." Part of what solution? Mara wondered. Back at her apartment, she retrieved her old audio recorder from a locked box in the closet. She still had her contacts, old sources from her reporting days, though many had gone quiet or vanished entirely. One number, still active, belonged to a former Air Force contractor named Elgin Ward. She met him once during a story on defense, logistics he owed her. When she called, he answered on the second ring. "You're late," he said. "Late for what?" "For realizing." There was a long pause. "Meet me at the old rail station, platform C, midnight." The line went dead. Mara packed lightly. One notepad, the recorder, a backup battery, and cash. At 11:57 p.m., she stood under the flickering light at platform C. Trains no longer ran this far out. The wind moved through the beams like a whisper. Elgin arrived at 12:01 wearing a heavy coat and no expression. "You saw the video?"
he asked. Mara nodded. "I need to know what was in that release." Elgin looked past her, scanning the shadows. "You don't want to know, but since you're here, fine. It's not chemical, it's coded." Mara blinked. "Coded?" He nodded.
"Not a toxin, not a hormone, an instruction." Mara didn't speak for a moment. The cold pressed into her skin, but her thoughts moved faster than her breath. "Coded how?" she asked. Elgin kept his hands in his pockets. "Microcarrier, dispersal, nanostructures built to activate biologically, not visible, not traceable. Once inhaled, they attach to receptors in the reproductive axis. The signal doesn't break anything. It tells the body to change course." "Change how?" "Statistical reduction. Fertility probability lowered by algorithm. Personalized, quiet and irreversible." Mara stepped back. "Why would anyone do this?" Elgin looked tired. "Because the models say we're past the carrying threshold. Food systems can't scale. Water access is already triaged. They ran simulations, selected outcomes. This one causes the least unrest. Slower, deniable, framed as natural decline." "Who's behind it?" she asked. "Doesn't matter. It's beyond state level. This was signed off globally. You think it's just this city? This is phase 3. Mara stared past the tracks. She remembered the calmness in the doctor's voice, the identical phrasing in the nurse's response. "And the video?" she asked. "You weren't supposed to see it," he said. "That drop wasn't logged properly. Weather shift revealed the outline." "Who sent it to me?" He shook his head. "I didn't." He pulled out a small drive and handed it to her. "That's all I have. Internal documents, some simulations, a few flight maps. Don't keep it on your device. Copy it and burn
it." She took it without speaking. Elgin turned to go, then paused. "They've mapped behavioral flags, search patterns, keyword usage, medical queries."
"If you're asking questions, you're already tagged. Your name's probably in a folder." "What kind of folder?" He didn't answer, just walked into the darkness. Mara stood alone on the platform, the cold now fully inside her. She didn't go home. Instead, she found a cheap motel outside city limits, paid in cash, and unplugged the room's modem. At dawn, she opened the drive. No labels, no metadata, just folders named with numbers. She clicked the first. Inside was a document titled "Sterile Sky, Implementation Protocol, Post-2029. Her hands shook as she scrolled. The language was calm, clinical, efficient. The last line was a directive: behavioral deviations to be corrected through memory normalization protocols. Mara read the directive 3 times before closing the file. Memory normalization protocols. The phrase unsettled her more than the dispersal methods or the algorithmic targeting. This wasn't just sterilization, it was control of perception. She copied the entire drive to an encrypted SD card, then smashed the motel TV and stuffed the remnants into the trash. Cameras were too easy to hide. She left before checkout, ditching the SD card in a locked deposit box, registered under a fake name. By afternoon, her phone powered itself on in her bag despite being switched off. The screen blinked once, then displayed a text. Too late to stop, but not too late to forget. She dropped it in a public trash can and walked until her legs hurt. That night, she returned to her apartment against her better judgment. Everything inside looked untouched but felt wrong. On her desk, her old recorder sat neatly beside her notepad, items she hadn't brought home. She picked up the recorder. It played back static, then her voice, reading questions she had never recorded. She sat down slowly. Her laptop, now functioning, displayed a single open window. A local news article. Urban Stress and Fertility, the hidden link, the author, listed was her name. She hadn't written it. Her byline, her photo, even quotes from interviews that never happened. The language mirrored her recent notes, twisted into sanitized conclusions. The piece blamed fertility drops on late-stage capitalism, poor diet, and sedentary lifestyles. A smiling doctor offered advice on stress management. The page was dated 3 days ago. Mara turned to the window. Across the street, her neighbor stood perfectly still on his balcony. He raised a hand, not waving, just showing his palm, and disappeared inside. Her computer screen went black. A voice, flat and synthetic, came from the speaker. Subject profile flagged for recursive correction. She grabbed the recorder and backed out of the room. The hallway lights flickered as she descended. By the time she reached the sidewalk, she could barely remember what had triggered her panic. The drive, the article. Her hands trembled. Her name felt foreign. She walked into the cold night, unsure where to go. All she knew was this. Forgetting was the real weapon. Mara didn't stop walking until she reached the outer district, a stretch of warehouses and empty lots that used to house freight traffic. The wind cut through the steel frames and chain-link fences like a blade, but she welcomed the sting. It kept her focused. She found an abandoned building with boarded windows and forced the door open. Inside, it smelled of rust and mildew, but it was dark, quiet, and disconnected. She lit a small camping stove and sat on a crate, trying to recall what she still knew for certain. Her name, her sister, the video, Elgin's words, but even now fragments felt unstable. Memories reshaped as if edited. Some details blurred at the edges, others felt too vivid, like they'd been replayed too often. She pulled out the notepad, flipping through pages of notes written in her own hand. Some entries made sense. Others looked unfamiliar, like someone else had added them in her handwriting. One page was just a list of names. Women she'd interviewed, clinics she'd called. She recognized none of them. Her hands trembled. She closed the notebook. Across the room, a metal cabinet stood half open. Inside, she found old medical files and tagged inventory sheets. One caught her eye. It listed equipment transfers from a fertility center that had closed last year. The destination was a location she knew well, an old data facility leased by a biotech firm. It was supposed to be under renovation. Mara circled the address and memorized it. She stayed in the building until just before dawn, then made her way across town. The structure stood behind tall fencing, the name of the original clinic still faintly visible beneath new signage. A guard post sat empty. She climbed the fence and slipped inside through a loose service door. The lights were on. Quiet, sterile, light. The walls were lined with monitors, not medical charts. Facial recognition logs flicked by. Her photo appeared briefly, tagged with a status. Monitored, high-risk deviant. Dozens of other profiles followed. Women of childbearing age, flagged with terms like low compliance, non-responsive, elevated suspicion. In the back room, a server hummed softly. She sat at the terminal. No passwords, just a single prompt. Sterile sky access confirmed. Mara placed her fingers on the keyboard, hesitant but steady. She had no plan beyond this moment. The screen blinked once, then opened a dashboard filled with timelines, population grids, and tagged maps. At the top corner, a logo, Orion Systems. She remembered the name from a Senate hearing years ago, buried in testimony about bioethics waivers and emergency climate provisions. The dashboard displayed regional fertility scores, constantly updating, marked in green, yellow, and deep red. Each red zone corresponded with cities she'd flagged earlier. She clicked through tabs labeled Behavioral Filtering, Compliance Risk, and Intervention Cycles. One document detailed selection algorithms that sorted individuals by reproductive viability, adjusted by income, mental health history, and social engagement scores. The term statistical burden reduction appeared repeatedly. It wasn't just about resources, it was about reshaping the population itself, quietly, efficiently, with no visible lines. She downloaded what she could, feeding data into a secure drive she'd hidden in her coat. Then she opened a folder labeled Protocol 9, Subject Conditioning. Inside were reports on neural feedback tools, audio pulses, electromagnetic modulation, pattern exposure. Techniques designed to erase doubt, destabilize memory, reduce resistance. And it worked. She had lived it. The static recordings, the fake articles, the hollow gaps in her mind. She copied that too. Then the server screen froze. A voice, flat and calm, filled the room. Mara Quinn, you are in breach of Directive 12. Please remain still for reintegration. The lights dimmed. Doors locked. She backed away, searching for an exit, but there was none. The walls flickered with silent images, her face, distorted audio, fragments of thoughts she'd never spoken aloud. The air vibrated, low and steady. Her balance faltered. She dropped to her knees. The last thing she saw was the word normalize scrolling across the screen. When she awoke, she was outside, on a park bench, early morning traffic humming in the distance. Her hands were clean, her clothes pressed. A passerby smiled at her politely. Her name didn't come to mind immediately. Her phone buzzed. A notification blinked. Welcome back, Mara. Breathe deeply. All is well. But something sharp lingered beneath the calm, a splinter in her thoughts, a voice she couldn't place whispering, "They're lying," and she believed it, without knowing why. She stood and walked, not to run, not to forget, but to begin again.